Part 1. Introduction. Deconstructing the myth. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media, and you encounter yet another post about the golden age of ancient India. The image shows serene sages meditating under banyan trees, magnificent palaces gleaming in the sunset, and peaceful villages where enlightened beings lived in perfect harmony with nature. The caption reads something like, "Why can't we return to the wisdom of our ancestors?" Or, "Ancient India, when humanity reached its spiritual peak." Sound familiar? If you spent any time consuming content about ancient civilizations, particularly ancient India, you've undoubtedly encountered this narrative. It's everywhere, in documentaries, books, social media posts, and even academic discussions that should know better. But here's the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to talk about. This romanticized vision of ancient India is not just misleading. It's a dangerous distortion of historical reality that obscures some of the harshest living conditions humanity has ever endured. The romanticization phenomenon. Before we dive into the brutal realities of life in ancient India, we need to understand how and why this romanticization occurred in the first place. The idealized image of ancient India didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the product of centuries of cultural, political, and intellectual forces that have shaped our collective understanding of the past. The romanticization began during the colonial period, ironically enough, when European scholars and administrators encountered Indian philosophical and religious texts. Faced with the profound complexity of works like the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and various Buddhist scriptures, many Western intellectuals became enamored with what they perceived as the spiritual superiority of ancient Indian civilization. Figures like Max Muller, though well-intentioned, contributed to creating an image of ancient India as a land of pure philosophical inquiry and spiritual enlightenment. This colonial-era fascination was later amplified during India's independence movement, when leaders and intellectuals understandably sought to reclaim their cultural heritage and present a counter-narrative to colonial claims of civilizational inferiority. The emphasis on ancient India's achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy served important political and psychological purposes, but also led to an overcorrection that glossed over the harsh realities of daily life for the vast majority of the population. In the modern era, this romanticization has been further fueled by several factors. The New Age spiritual movement has cherry-picked elements from ancient Indian traditions, presenting them as solutions to contemporary problems while ignoring their historical context. Popular culture, from Hollywood movies to yoga studios, has perpetuated images of ancient India as a mystical land where enlightened beings lived in perfect harmony. Social media has accelerated this trend exponentially. Instagram posts featuring ancient temples are captioned with profound-sounding quotes attributed to ancient sages. YouTube videos promise to reveal ancient Indian secrets, for everything from perfect health to unlimited wealth. TikTok creators dress up as ancient Indian royalty, presenting sanitized versions of historical periods that bear little resemblance to reality. The idealized image versus historical reality. Let's examine the specific elements of this romanticized narrative and contrast them with what historical evidence actually tells us. The myth of universal spirituality. The popular narrative suggests that ancient Indians were naturally more spiritual and enlightened than modern people. The reality? Spirituality and philosophical inquiry were largely the privilege of the elite classes. While texts like the Vedas and Upanishads represent remarkable intellectual achievements, they were created by and for a tiny fraction of the population, primarily upper-caste males who had the luxury of time and education. The vast majority of the population was too busy struggling to survive to engage in philosophical contemplation. The wisdom of ancient medicine. Yes, ancient Indian texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita contain remarkable medical knowledge for their time. But this doesn't mean that effective health care was widely available. These medical traditions were accessible only to the wealthy and powerful. The average person relied on folk remedies, superstitions, and often harmful practices. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Life expectancy was brutally short, and treatable diseases regularly decimated entire communities. The peaceful, harmonious society. Perhaps the most persistent myth is that ancient Indian society was characterized by peace, harmony, and social justice. This narrative completely ignores the rigid caste system that condemned millions to lives of brutal oppression, the constant warfare between kingdoms, the systematic exploitation of lower classes, and the severe restrictions placed on women's lives. Technological and scientific supremacy. While ancient India did make significant contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and other fields, the narrative often exaggerates these achievements and ignores their limited practical impact on daily life. Yes, ancient Indian mathematicians developed concepts like zero and advanced astronomical calculations, but this didn't translate into improved living conditions for ordinary people who continue to live in conditions that we would consider barely survivable today. Environmental harmony. The idea that ancient Indians lived in perfect balance with nature is another persistent myth. While it's true that many ancient Indian texts express reverence for nature, the reality is that environmental degradation, deforestation, and resource depletion were significant problems even in ancient times. Archaeological evidence shows that several ancient Indian civilizations collapsed partly due to environmental mismanagement. Defining our time period, 3300 BC to 500 AD. For the purposes of this exploration, we're focusing on a vast span of ancient Indian history, from approximately 3300 BC to 500 AD. This encompasses several major periods and civilizations, each with its own characteristics, but united by certain harsh realities of pre-modern life. The Indus Valley Civilization, 3300 to 1300 BC, often praised for its urban planning and sophisticated drainage systems. The Indus Valley Civilization represents one of humanity's earliest experiments in large-scale urban living. However, recent archaeological evidence suggests that life was far from idyllic. Social stratification was evident, sanitation systems regularly failed, and the civilization's mysterious collapse likely involved significant suffering for its inhabitants. The Vedic period, 1500 to 500 BC, this era saw the composition of the earliest Hindu texts and the establishment of many religious and social traditions that continue today. It was also the period when the caste system began to solidify into the rigid hierarchy that would dominate Indian society for millennia. The Vedic period is often romanticized as a golden age of spiritual wisdom, but it was also marked by constant tribal warfare, animal sacrifice, and the systematic oppression of lower social groups. The Mauryan Empire, 322 to 185 BC, under rulers like Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire achieved remarkable political unity across much of the Indian subcontinent. However, this unity came at a tremendous cost in human suffering. The empire was built through brutal conquest, maintained through harsh authoritarian rule, and sustained by the systematic exploitation of peasant farmers and laborers. The classical period, 200 BC, 500 AD, often considered the golden age of ancient India. This period saw remarkable achievements in art, literature, science, and philosophy under dynasties like the Guptas. However, it was also characterized by rigid social hierarchies, frequent warfare, and living conditions that remained harsh for the vast majority of the population. Throughout all these periods, certain harsh realities remained constant. Life expectancy rarely exceeded 30 years, infant mortality rates were catastrophically high, famine and disease were regular occurrences, and social mobility was virtually non-existent for the vast majority of people. The promise of truth. Over the course of this exploration, we're going to systematically examine the harsh realities that the romanticized narrative conveniently ignores. We'll look at archaeological evidence, contemporary texts, and scholarly research to build a more accurate picture of what life was actually like for ordinary people in ancient India. We'll explore the brutal realities of the caste system, not just as an abstract social concept, but as a lived experience that condemned millions to lives of degradation and suffering. We'll examine the shocking conditions faced by women, who were often treated as property to be bought, sold, and disposed of at will. We'll investigate the primitive state of medicine and horrific diseases that regularly swept through communities, killing thousands. We'll look at the constant warfare that plagued the subcontinent, the chronic food insecurity that kept populations on the brink of starvation, and a harsh system of justice that relied on brutal physical punishments and arbitrary judgments. We'll examine the exploitation of children, who were forced into dangerous labor from an early age, and the environmental degradation that accompanied ancient attempts at development. This isn't an exercise in historical pessimism or cultural criticism. Instead, it's an attempt to understand the past more accurately and honestly. By confronting the harsh realities of ancient life, we can better appreciate the genuine progress that humanity has made over the centuries. We can also develop a more nuanced understanding of how ancient achievements in philosophy, science, and culture emerged despite, not because of the brutal conditions of daily life. Why this matters today. You might wonder why it's important to challenge romanticized views of ancient India. After all, is it harmless to find inspiration in idealized versions of the past? Unfortunately, the answer is no. These distorted narratives have real consequences in the present. When we romanticize the past, we risk losing sight of genuine progress and the ongoing need for social reform. If ancient India was truly a golden age of spiritual enlightenment and social harmony, then contemporary problems can be blamed on modernity rather than recognized as continuations of ancient injustices that require ongoing attention. Furthermore, romanticized historical narratives can be exploited by political movements seeking to justify regressive policies or resist necessary social changes. When people believe that ancient societies were more virtuous or enlightened than contemporary ones, they may be more receptive to calls to return to traditional practices, even when those practices involve the systematic oppression of marginalized groups. Finally, accurate historical understanding is simply valuable in its own right. The people of ancient India, both the powerful and the powerless, deserve to have their stories told honestly. The magnificent achievements of ancient Indian civilization are all the more remarkable when we understand the harsh conditions under which they were created. Moving forward, as we embark on this journey through the harsh realities of ancient Indian life, it's important to maintain perspective. The goal isn't to demonize ancient Indian civilization or to dismiss its genuine achievements. Instead, we're seeking a more complete and honest understanding of the past, one that acknowledges both the remarkable accomplishments and the brutal suffering that characterized ancient life. The people of ancient India were not fundamentally different from us. They faced the same basic human challenges, the need for food, shelter, security, and meaning, but they did so without the benefit of modern medicine, technology, legal systems, or social institutions. Their struggles and suffering were real, and their stories deserve to be told without romantic embellishment. By the end of this exploration, you'll have a more accurate and complete picture of what life was actually like in ancient India. You'll understand why the romanticized narratives are not just inaccurate, but actively harmful to historical understanding. And perhaps most importantly, you'll gain a deeper appreciation for the genuine progress that humanity has made, progress that continues to this day as we work to build more just, equitable, and humane societies. The truth about ancient India is harsh, but it's also ultimately hopeful. It reminds us that human beings are capable of both creating beauty and meaning under the most difficult circumstances, and of gradually building better ways of life for future generations. That's a story worth telling accurately. Part 2. The caste system, the ultimate social prison, the most oppressive social system in human history. Imagine being born into a world where your entire life, your profession, your spouse, where you can live, what you can eat, whom you can touch, and even how you must die, is predetermined by an accident of birth. Imagine a system so rigid that no amount of talent, hard work, virtue, or achievement could ever change your designated place in society. This wasn't some dystopian fiction. This was a daily reality for hundreds of millions of people in ancient India under the caste system, arguably the most comprehensive and enduring system of social oppression in human history. While modern discussions of the caste system often present it as a benign social organization or a cultural tradition, the historical reality was far more sinister. The caste system wasn't just social stratification. It was a totalitarian system of human classification that reduced people to their supposed ritual purity and trapped them in hereditary prisons from which there was no escape. The rigid hierarchy, a divinely sanctioned prison. The classical caste system, as codified in texts like the Manusmriti, Laws of Manu, divided society into 4 primary varnas, each with supposed divine origin and prescribed function. But this seemingly simple 4-fold division concealed a reality far more complex and oppressive. The Brahmins, the self-appointed divine class. At the apex of this hierarchy sat the Brahmins, who claimed exclusive access to divine knowledge and ritual authority. According to the mythological justification found in the Purusha Sukta hymn of the Rig Veda, Brahmins were born from the mouth of the cosmic being Purusha. making them the most sacred and pure members of society. But this wasn't merely a position of respect. It was a license for exploitation. Brahmins claimed the right to receive gifts and donations from all other castes without any obligation to reciprocate. They could demand free food, shelter, and services from lower castes as a religious duty. Perhaps most insidiously, they held a monopoly on education and literacy, ensuring that the very knowledge needed to question or challenge the system remained in their exclusive control. The Brahmins' supposed purity was so sacred that their presence could purify spaces and objects, while their anger could supposedly curse entire lineages. This gave them tremendous psychological power over the population. A Brahmin's blessing was desperately sought, while their displeasure was feared more than natural disasters. Historical records reveal the extent of Brahmin privilege. They were exempt from capital punishment, even for the most heinous crimes. While members of lower castes could be executed for relatively minor offenses, a Brahmin who committed murder might receive only exile or ritual penance. They paid no taxes, could not be tortured during legal proceedings, and their testimony in court held more weight than that of any lower caste person. The Kshatriyas, warriors bound by honor and violence. The second tier belonged to Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruling class, supposedly born from the arms of Purusha. While they held political and military power, they were still subordinate to Brahmin spiritual authority, a subordination that created constant tension but was ultimately maintained through religious ideology. Kshatriyas were bound by the code of Dharma to protect society, but this protection came with a terrible cost. Young men were trained from childhood for warfare, with little consideration for their individual preferences or aptitudes. The warrior culture glorified death in battle, while condemning those who showed reluctance to fight as cowards unworthy of their caste status. The pressure on Kshatriya families was immense. Sons who failed to display martial prowess brought shame to their entire lineage. Daughters were often married off as children to cement political alliances, with no regard for their welfare or preferences. The constant warfare that characterized ancient India meant that Kshatriya families regularly lost their male members, leaving widows and children in precarious positions. Archaeological evidence from ancient battlefields reveals the brutal reality of Kshatriya warfare. Mass graves contain the remains of young men, many showing signs of malnutrition and disease even before their violent deaths. The glorified image of noble warriors fighting honorable battles conceals a reality of desperate young men forced into combat by social expectations they could never escape. The Vaishyas, the constrained merchant class. The third Varna, the Vaishyas, were supposedly born from the thighs of Purusha and were designated as the merchant and farming class. While often described as prosperous traders and landowners, the reality for most Vaishyas was far more constrained than popular narratives suggest. Vaishya merchants operated under severe restrictions. They could trade in certain goods, but were prohibited from others. They could accumulate wealth, but were expected to donate generously to Brahmins and temples. Their success was always precarious, dependent on maintaining good relationships with both the Brahmin religious establishment and Kshatriya political authorities. Perhaps most importantly, wealthy Vaishyas could never translate their economic success into a higher social status. A Vaishya merchant might own vast trading networks and palatial homes, but he would still have to show deference to an impoverished Brahmin. His children, no matter how educated or accomplished, would remain Vaishyas. His wealth could buy comfort, but never dignity or true social acceptance. The agricultural Vaishyas faced even harsher realities. While theoretically land-owning farmers, many were reduced to sharecropping or tenant farming due to debts, natural disasters, or political upheavals. Ancient tax records show that farmers often surrendered substantial portions of their harvest to rulers, leaving barely enough for subsistence. Failed harvests could force entire Vaishya families into bondage or force them to sell their children. The Shudras, the permanent servant class. At the bottom of the official Varna system were the Shudras, supposedly born from the feet of Purusha and destined for a life of service to the three higher Varnas. The Shudras represented the largest segment of the population, yet they were denied virtually all rights and subjected to systematic exploitation. Shudras were prohibited from studying the Vedas, participating in most religious ceremonies, or even hearing sacred texts being recited. The Manusmriti explicitly states that if a Shudra overheard Vedic recitation, his ears should be filled with molten lead. If he attempted to recite sacred texts, his tongue should be cut out. These weren't theoretical punishments. Court records and historical accounts document cases where such brutal penalties were actually carried out. The occupational restrictions on Shudras were comprehensive and degrading. They were assigned the most dangerous, dirty, and socially despised jobs: cleaning, leather working, metal smelting, and waste disposal. These occupations not only exposed them to serious health hazards, but also reinforced their impure status in society. Shudra women faced double oppression. They could be sexually exploited by upper caste men with virtual impunity. Such relationships were seen as the natural right of superior castes rather than crimes. They had no legal recourse, no protection from authorities, and no social support systems. Historical records contain numerous accounts of Shudra women being abducted, raped, or forced into concubinage with no consequences for the perpetrators. The economic exploitation of Shudras was systematic and brutal. They were often paid in food scraps rather than money, keeping them in perpetual poverty and dependence. They could be forced to work without compensation under guise of service to their betters. Their children could be taken as payment for debts, and entire Shudra families could be sold along with land during property transfers. The untouchables, beyond the pale of humanity, below even the Shudras, existed groups that were considered so impure they fell outside the Varna system entirely. These were people later known as untouchables or Dalits, human beings who were treated as less than human by the rest of society. The concept of untouchability went far beyond simple social discrimination. Untouchables were believed to pollute everything they touched, requiring elaborate purification rituals for anyone who came into contact with them. They were forced to live outside village boundaries, forbidden from using common wells or entering temples, and required to announce their presence when approaching so that others could avoid them. The occupations assigned to untouchables were the most degrading imaginable: handling dead bodies, cleaning human waste, disposing of animal carcasses, and working with materials considered inherently polluting. These jobs not only exposed them to serious health risks, but also reinforced their social degradation in a vicious cycle that lasted generations. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements reveals the stark reality of untouchable living conditions. Their dwellings were consistently the smallest, most poorly constructed, and located in areas prone to flooding or other natural hazards. Skeletal remains show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and physical abuse significantly more severe than other social groups. The impossibility of social mobility. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the caste system was its absolute denial of social mobility. Unlike other hierarchical societies where individuals might rise through military service, religious devotion, or economic success, the caste system made such advancement literally impossible. Birth as destiny. The doctrine of karma was weaponized to justify this immobility. People were told that their caste position reflected their actions in previous lives. High caste birth was a reward for past virtue, while low caste birth was punishment for past sins. This created a theological prison where questioning one's position was tantamount to questioning divine justice itself. This karmic justification had profound psychological effects. It encouraged fatalism among lower castes while providing upper castes with convenient moral justification for exploitation. A Brahmin extracting free labor from Shudras was exploiting them. He was allowing them to work off their karmic debts. A Kshatriya brutalizing untouchables wasn't committing injustice. He was maintaining the divine order. The hereditary trap. The hereditary nature of caste meant that individual merit was irrelevant. A brilliant Shudra child would never receive education comparable to a mediocre Brahmin. A brave and capable untouchable could never become a warrior, regardless of his fighting ability. A shrewd and honest low-caste person could never engage in respectable trade, no matter his business acumen. Historical records contain heartbreaking accounts of individuals who attempted to transcend their caste boundaries through exceptional achievement, only to be violently forced back into their designated roles. Buddhist and Jain texts, which were generally more sympathetic to lower castes, still contain numerous stories of people being punished for forgetting their place in the social hierarchy. Marriage as caste enforcement. The marriage system served as one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining caste boundaries. Inter-caste marriages were not just discouraged, They were often treated as capital crimes. The children of such unions faced severe discrimination, often being relegated to even lower social positions than their lower caste parent. Marriage within caste was carefully regulated to maintain not just caste purity, but also subcaste hierarchies. Even within the broad Varna categories, hundreds of subcastes, jatis, existed, each with its own restrictions and hierarchies. A person might be born into the Brahmin Varna but still face discrimination from other Brahmin subcastes based on regional origin, specific occupational specialization, or historical circumstances. The control over marriage gave caste panchayats, councils, enormous power over individual lives. These bodies could ostracize families, arrange forced marriages, or even order killings to maintain caste purity. Their decisions were backed not just by social pressure, but often by political authorities who depended on caste leaders for social stability. The practical consequences: living under caste apartheid. The caste system wasn't an abstract social theory. It had concrete, devastating effects on every aspect of daily life. Understanding these practical consequences helps us grasp the true brutality of the system. Occupational predestination. The most immediate effect of caste was occupational restriction. Your birth determined not just what work you could do, but what work you must do. A Brahmin son couldn't choose to become a farmer or craftsman without losing his caste status. A Kshatriya couldn't pursue scholarly interests without being considered a failure to his lineage. A Vaishya couldn't take up arms or pursue priestly duties regardless of his inclinations or abilities. For lower castes, occupational restrictions were even more severe. Shudras were forbidden from pursuing any occupation that might bring them respect or economic independence. They couldn't become teachers, judges, or administrators. They couldn't own substantial property or engage in profitable trade. Their occupational choices were limited to serving the upper castes in various capacities. Archaeological evidence from ancient workshops and craft centers reveals the harsh reality of caste-based occupational restrictions. Tools and workspaces show clear segregation based on supposed purity of different crafts. Metal workers, considered impure due to their association with fire and transformation, were physically separated from other craftsmen. Leather workers were relegated to the outskirts of settlements, their products collected by intermediaries to avoid direct contact with higher castes. Residential segregation. Caste determined not just what work you did, but where you could live. Ancient Indian settlements were carefully segregated, with clear physical boundaries between different caste areas. Brahmins lived in the most desirable areas, often near temples and water sources. Kshatriyas occupied defensible positions suitable for warriors. Vaishyas lived in commercial districts near markets and trading centers. Shudras were relegated to less desirable areas, often prone to flooding or other natural hazards. Untouchables were forced to live completely outside settled areas, sometimes separated by physical barriers like walls or rivers. These residential restrictions weren't just about social preference. They were enforced through violence and legal sanctions. Archaeological excavations of ancient settlements clearly show this residential segregation. Housing quality, access to drainage systems, proximity to clean water sources, and even the quality of construction materials vary dramatically between different areas based on the caste status of their inhabitants. Lower caste areas consistently show evidence of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate protection from the elements. Dietary restrictions and food apartheid. The caste system extended its control even to what people could eat and with whom they could share meals. Complex rules governed food preparation, consumption, and sharing, creating a system of dietary apartheid that reinforced social hierarchies. Brahmins could accept food only from other Brahmins or from specific higher subcastes. They were forbidden from eating with lower castes or even accepting water from them. These restrictions meant that Brahmins required elaborate arrangements for meals when traveling or attending social functions, reinforcing their special status, while creating practical barriers to social interaction. Lower castes faced the opposite restrictions. They were often forbidden from consuming foods considered pure or prestigious. Certain types of meat, dairy products, and even vegetables were reserved for higher castes. Untouchables were restricted to the most degraded foods, often the scraps and refuse rejected by others. The psychological impact of these dietary restrictions was profound. Food sharing is one of the most basic forms of human social bonding, and the caste system deliberately destroyed this bonding between different social groups. A starving, untouchable child could watch upper caste children feast while being forbidden from sharing their meal, not due to scarcity, but due to supposed ritual pollution. Severe punishments enforcing the social prison. The caste system wasn't maintained merely through social pressure. It was enforced through a brutal system of punishments that terrorized anyone who dared challenge the established order. The legal codes, religious texts, and historical records all document the extreme violence used to maintain caste boundaries. Legal sanctions and differential justice. Ancient Indian legal codes explicitly prescribe different punishments for the same crimes based on the caste of both perpetrator and victim. The Manusmriti, which served as a legal foundation for much of ancient India, clearly states that crimes against higher castes deserve more severe punishment than crimes against lower castes. A Shudra who struck a Brahmin could face death or mutilation, while a Brahmin who killed a Shudra might pay only a fine equivalent to the cost of a cow. These weren't theoretical distinctions. Court records and inscriptions document numerous cases where such differential justice was actually applied. The testimony of witnesses was also weighted by caste. A single Brahmin's word could outweigh the testimony of multiple lower caste witnesses. This meant that upper caste individuals could commit crimes against lower castes with virtual impunity, knowing that the legal system would protect them. Physical mutilation and public humiliation. Those who violated caste boundaries faced not just legal penalties, but often brutal physical punishments designed to serve as public examples. Historical accounts document cases of individuals having their tongues cut out for reciting sacred texts above their station, their ears filled with molten metal for hearing forbidden knowledge, or their hands severed for touching sacred objects. These mutilations weren't carried out in private. They were public spectacles designed to terrorize others who might consider challenging the system. The message was clear. The caste system was not a matter of custom or preference, but divine order that would be maintained through extreme violence if necessary. Archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. Skeletal remains from ancient sites occasionally show evidence of deliberate mutilation that matches the punishments described in legal texts. More commonly, they show evidence of malnutrition and abuse consistent with systematic social oppression, social death, and economic destruction. Perhaps more devastating than physical punishments was the threat of social ostracism, being cut off from all community support and economic opportunities. Families who violated caste rules could find themselves completely isolated, unable to participate in religious ceremonies, social functions, or economic transactions. This social death was often more feared than physical death because it affected not just individuals, but their entire family for generations. Children of ostracized families would grow up as pariahs, unable to find marriage partners, employment, or community acceptance. The threat of such total social destruction kept most people firmly within their prescribed roles. The economic component of this ostracism was particularly devastating. In a society where most economic relationships were based on caste networks, being cut off from one's caste community meant economic ruin. Craftsmen couldn't sell their goods, farmers couldn't access markets, and even basic services like water and food became difficult to obtain. The psychological prison, internalized oppression. The most insidious aspect of the caste system was how it encouraged people to internalize their oppression. Through religious doctrine, social conditioning, and constant reinforcement, the system convinced many of its victims that their suffering was not only deserved but spiritually beneficial. Lower caste individuals were taught to see their degraded status as an opportunity for spiritual purification. They were told that accepting their lot without complaint would improve their karma and lead to better rebirths. This theological manipulation transformed victims into collaborators in their own oppression. The psychological impact of this internalized oppression cannot be overstated. When people believe their suffering is divinely ordained, they're less likely to resist or seek change. The caste system didn't just control people's bodies and actions. It colonized their minds and spirits, making them accomplices in maintaining the very system that oppressed them. The enduring legacy. The caste system of ancient India represents one of humanity's most comprehensive experiments in social oppression. It created a society where accident of birth determined every aspect of life, where social mobility was impossible, and where systematic exploitation was justified through religious doctrine. Understanding this system in all its brutal detail isn't an exercise in historical condemnation. It's essential for comprehending how social oppression functions and endures. The caste system succeeded in maintaining itself for millennia precisely because it was so comprehensive, touching every aspect of human existence and backed by religious authority, legal sanctions, and social terror. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about the wisdom or harmony of ancient India, remember the hundreds of millions of people who lived and died trapped in the social prison, their potential wasted, their dignity denied, and their humanity systematically degraded by one of history's most oppressive systems. Their stories deserve to be told, and their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, not romanticized or forgotten. Part 3. Living conditions of the lower classes. The forgotten majority. Life at the bottom of ancient India. When we discuss ancient civilizations, we often focus on the magnificent temples, the philosophical treatises, the royal courts, and the artistic achievements. But these visible remnants of the past represent only a tiny fraction of the human experience. The vast majority of people in ancient India, perhaps 80 to 90% of the population, lived lives of grinding poverty, systematic exploitation, and unimaginable hardship as members of the lower castes. Their stories have been largely erased from popular narratives, but archaeological evidence, administrative records, and scattered textual references reveal a reality so harsh that it challenges our most basic assumptions about human dignity and social organization. To understand the true nature of ancient Indian society, we must look beyond the golden temples and philosophical texts to examine the mud huts, the refuse heaps, the contaminated water sources, and the skeletal remains that tell the story of how the majority actually lived. What we find is a systematic apparatus of human degradation that reduced millions of people to conditions barely compatible with survival, let alone dignity or hope. The reality for Shudras, servants without rights. The Shudras, officially the fourth and lowest Varna in the classical system, represented the largest single group in ancient Indian society. Despite their numbers, they were systematically excluded from virtually all forms of social, economic, and political participation beyond their designated role as servants to the upper castes. Occupational bondage and exploitation. Shudra occupations were not chosen. They were imposed through a combination of religious doctrine, social pressure, and economic necessity. The work assigned to Shudras was invariably the most dangerous, physically demanding, and socially degrading available. They served as agricultural laborers, domestic servants, construction workers, and craftsmen in trades considered impure by upper caste standards. Archaeological evidence from ancient workshops reveals the harsh reality of Shudra working conditions. Excavations at metalworking sites show cramped, poorly ventilated spaces where workers were exposed to toxic fumes from smelting operations. Skeletal remains from these areas consistently show evidence of respiratory diseases, metal poisoning, and workplace injuries that would have caused chronic pain and disability. In agricultural settings, Shudras worked as tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and day laborers. Land ownership records carved in stone and preserved on copper plates show that Shudras rarely owned productive land. Instead, working plots belonged to upper caste landlords under terms that were invariably exploitative. During harvest seasons, they might receive a tenth or less of the crop they had grown, with the remainder go to landlords, tax collectors, and religious institutions. The construction industry relied heavily on Shudra labor for the massive building projects that characterized ancient Indian civilization. Those magnificent temples and palaces that we admire today were built with Shudra blood, sweat, and often lives. Construction sites were notoriously dangerous, with workers falling from heights, being crushed by massive stones, or succumbing to exhaustion. There were no safety regulations, no compensation for injuries, and no provisions for workers' families when breadwinners were killed or disabled. Economic exploitation and debt bondage. The economic relationship between Shudras and upper castes was fundamentally exploitative. Shudras were paid minimal wages, often in kind rather than currency, that were insufficient for basic survival. This systematic underpayment forced many Shudra families into debt, creating cycles of bondage that could last generations. Ancient administrative records document a widespread system of debt slavery that entrapped Shudra families. Unable to survive on their meager wages, families would borrow grain, tools, or money from upper-caste creditors at usurious interest rates. When they inevitably failed to repay these loans, entire families could be bonded to their creditors, working without wages to pay off debts that grew faster than they could be reduced. Children born into bonded families inherited their parents' debts, creating hereditary slavery disguised as economic relationship. Legal texts like the Narada Smriti explicitly recognize different categories of slaves, including debt slaves, and provide detailed regulations for their treatment. Regulations that reveal the systematic nature of this exploitation while offering no meaningful protections. Social humiliation and psychological oppression. Beyond economic exploitation, Shudras face constant social humiliation designed to reinforce their inferior status. They were required to show elaborate deference to members of higher castes, including physical gestures of submission, such as prostration and removal of footwear. Failure to show proper deference could result in physical punishment or social ostracism. The psychological impact of this constant humiliation cannot be overstated. Shudras were systematically taught that they were inherently inferior, that their suffering was deserved, and that their only hope for improvement lay in serving their superiors faithfully in hopes of a better rebirth. This psychological conditioning was reinforced through religious ceremonies, social interactions, and legal institutions that consistently treated Shudras as less than fully human. The Dalits, beyond the margins of humanity. Below even the Shudras existed communities that were considered so impure that they fell outside the official Varna system entirely. These groups, later known as Dalits or untouchables, experienced conditions that can only be described as systematic dehumanization on a massive scale. Occupational degradation. Dalit communities were assigned occupations that were considered so polluting that no one else would perform them. These included handling corpses, disposing of human and animal waste, working with leather from dead animals, and cleaning up after executions and other public punishments. These jobs were not just unpleasant. They were genuinely dangerous, exposing workers to infectious diseases, toxic substances, and psychological trauma. Archaeological excavations of ancient settlements revealed a spatial organization that enforced occupational segregation. Dalit work areas were invariably located downwind and downstream from other activities, ensuring that any pollution they generated would not contaminate higher caste areas. These work sites show evidence of poor drainage, accumulated waste, and inadequate shelter that would have made them breeding ground for disease. The leatherworking industry, dominated by Dalit communities, reveals particularly harsh working conditions. Processing animal hides required exposure to putrefying flesh, toxic chemicals for tanning, and the constant risk of infection from handling diseased animals. The tools and workspaces excavated from ancient leatherworking sites show evidence of minimal investment in worker safety or comfort. Social isolation and untouchability. The concept of untouchability went far beyond occupational segregation to encompass a comprehensive system of social apartheid. Dalits were considered so polluting that their mere presence could contaminate higher caste individuals, requiring elaborate purification rituals to restore ritual purity. This belief in pollution was not metaphorical. It had devastating practical consequences. Dalits were forbidden from entering temples, using public wells, attending markets during peak hours, or even walking on roads used by higher castes. In many areas, they were required to carry bells or other noisemakers to warn of their approach so that others could avoid contamination. The social isolation extended to housing arrangements. Dalit settlements were physically separated from other communities, often by walls, rivers, or other barriers. These segregated areas, called Dalit wadas or similar terms, were invariably located in the least desirable areas, flood-prone lowlands, areas without access to clean water, or regions exposed to environmental hazards. Educational and cultural exclusion. Perhaps most devastatingly, Dalits were systematically excluded from education and cultural participation. They were forbidden from learning to read and write, from hearing religious texts, and from participating in cultural activities that might have provided meaning or hope. This educational exclusion ensured that Dalit communities remained trapped in their designated roles, unable to develop the skills or knowledge that might have allowed them to improve their conditions. The few Dalit individuals who somehow acquired literacy or cultural knowledge faced severe punishment. Legal texts describe brutal penalties for Dalits who overheard Vedic recitations or attempted to participate in religious ceremonies. These punishments were not just legal sanctions. They were terroristic acts designed to maintain the boundaries of the system through fear. Housing. Subhuman conditions on the margins. The housing conditions of lower caste communities in ancient India provide stark evidence of the systematic inequality that characterized a society. While upper caste families lived in substantial homes with multiple rooms, courtyards, and access to amenities, lower caste housing was characterized by overcrowding, poor construction, and dangerous locations. Construction and materials. Archaeological excavations reveal dramatic differences in construction quality between different caste areas. Upper caste homes were built with fired bricks, stone foundations, and tile roofs that provided protection from the elements. Lower caste housing, by contrast, was typically constructed from mud bricks, thatch, and other perishable materials that required constant maintenance and provided minimal protection. The difference in construction materials wasn't just about aesthetics or comfort. It was a matter of survival. Mud brick construction was vulnerable to monsoon floods, earthquakes, and fires that regularly devastated lower caste settlements. The use of thatch roofing meant that cooking fires posed constant hazards, and a lack of proper foundations made homes vulnerable to collapse. Excavations of lower caste residential areas consistently show evidence of frequent rebuilding, suggesting that these structures were regularly destroyed by natural disasters or structural failures. The constant need to rebuild homes meant that families could never accumulate wealth or improve their living conditions, trapped in cycles of reconstruction and poverty. Overcrowding and privacy. Lower caste homes were typically single-room structures that housed entire extended families. Archaeological evidence suggests that spaces as small as 10 by 12 feet might accommodate 8 to 10 people, including children, adults, and elderly family members. This overcrowding had devastating effects on health, privacy, and family relationships. The lack of private space meant that families had no refuge from social pressures or conflicts. Children grew up without privacy or quiet spaces for rest or reflection. Adults had no respite from the constant demands of family life. The elderly and sick had no separate spaces for recovery or comfort. Overcrowding also facilitated the rapid spread of infectious diseases. When one family member became ill, the entire household was typically infected within days. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from lower caste residential areas shows evidence of epidemic diseases that swept through these communities regularly, killing disproportionate numbers of children and elderly people. Location and environmental hazards. Lower caste settlements were invariably located in the least desirable areas of ancient cities and towns. These locations were chosen not for convenience or comfort of residents, but to minimize their contact with higher caste communities and to symbolically reinforce their low status. Dalit settlements were typically located outside city walls or boundaries, often in areas prone to flooding during monsoon seasons. Archaeological surveys of ancient urban sites consistently show lower caste residential areas in low-lying areas near rivers or streams where flood damage was regular and severe. The location of these settlements also exposed residents to environmental hazards that were avoided by other communities. Lower caste areas were often downwind from industrial activities like metalworking or pottery production, exposing residents to smoke, toxic fumes, and other pollutants. They were frequently located near waste disposal areas, increasing exposure to disease and contamination. Water, the fundamental inequality. Access to clean water represented one of the most basic and devastating inequalities in ancient Indian society. While upper caste communities had access to wells, tanks, and other clean water sources, lower caste communities were systematically excluded from these resources and forced to rely on contaminated sources that posed serious health risks. Segregated water sources. The concept of ritual pollution extended to water sources, creating a system of water apartheid that had deadly consequences for lower caste communities. Public wells, temple tanks, and other clean water sources were reserved for upper caste use. Lower caste individuals who attempted to draw water from these sources faced violent punishment and social ostracism. Archaeological evidence reveals the existence of separate water sources for different caste communities. Excavations of ancient settlements consistently show high-quality wells and tanks in upper caste residential areas. while lower caste areas relied on shallow wells, polluted streams, or collected rainwater that posed serious health risks. The quality difference between these water sources was dramatic. Upper caste wells were typically deep, stone-lined structures that accessed clean groundwater. Lower caste water sources were often little more than shallow pits that collected surface runoff contaminated with human and animal waste. Health consequences. The water inequality had devastating health consequences for lower caste communities. Contaminated water sources were breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that killed thousands annually. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from lower caste burial sites shows evidence of chronic intestinal infections and malnutrition consistent with regular consumption of contaminated water. Children were particularly vulnerable to waterborne diseases. Infant and child mortality rates in lower caste communities were catastrophically high, with some estimates suggesting that half or more children died before reaching adulthood. Many of these deaths were directly attributable to diseases caused by contaminated water. The cycle of water-related illness created a vicious circle of poverty and suffering. Families spent an enormous amount of time and resources caring for sick members, reducing their ability to work and earn income. The constant threat of waterborne disease created chronic stress and anxiety that affected entire communities. Water collection and labor burden. Even when lower caste communities had access to water sources, the burden of water collection typically fell on women and children who had to travel long distances and wait in lines for their turn to collect water. This water collection labor consumed hours each day that could have been spent on income-generating activities or education. The long distances to water sources also created safety risks, particularly for women and girls who were vulnerable to assault or harassment while traveling alone to remote water collection points. Historical accounts contain numerous references to violence against lower caste women during water collection activities. Food, malnutrition as social control. The food system in ancient India was structured to reinforce caste hierarchies through systematic malnutrition of lower caste communities. While upper caste families enjoyed varied diets with adequate protein, vitamins, and calories, lower caste communities were restricted to minimal, low-quality foods that barely sustained life. Dietary restrictions and food apartheid. The caste system imposed complex dietary restrictions that ensured that the best foods were reserved for upper caste consumption. Lower caste communities were forbidden from consuming many protein sources, dairy products, and other nutritious foods that were considered too pure for their consumption. These dietary restrictions weren't based on availability or cost. They were deliberately designed to maintain caste boundaries and ensure the physical weakness of subordinated populations. Well-nourished populations are more likely to resist oppression, while malnourished populations are more easily controlled and exploited. Archaeological analysis of food remains from different caste residential areas reveals dramatic differences in diet quality. Upper caste areas show evidence of varied diets, including multiple grains, legumes, dairy products, and meat from higher quality animals. Lower caste areas show evidence of monotonous diets based primarily on inferior grains, with minimal protein and vitamin sources. Chronic malnutrition and its effects. The systematic restriction of food quality and quantity created endemic malnutrition in lower caste communities. Skeletal analysis from ancient burial sites shows clear evidence of chronic malnutrition, including stunted growth, bone deformities, and dental problems that indicate lifelong dietary deficiency. Malnutrition had cascading effects beyond immediate health problems. Malnourished children showed reduced cognitive development, limiting their ability to learn skills or knowledge that might have improved their circumstances. Malnourished adults had reduced physical strength and endurance, limiting their work capacity and earning potential. The psychological effects of chronic hunger cannot be underestimated. Constantly hungry people have difficulty concentrating, planning for future, or engaging in activities beyond immediate survival. This hunger-induced focus on short-term survival made it difficult for lower caste communities to organize resistance or plan improvements to their conditions. Food as wages and control. Lower caste workers were typically paid in food rather than currency, giving employers direct control over their workers' nutrition and survival. This payment system allowed employers to provide minimal, low-quality food that kept workers alive but weak and dependent. The use of food as wages also created additional vulnerabilities for lower caste families. During economic downturns or agricultural failures, employers could reduce food payments, pushing worker families toward starvation. This constant threat of hunger was a powerful tool for maintaining labor discipline and preventing resistance. Medical care, excluded from healing. The medical system in ancient India, despite its sophisticated theoretical knowledge, was largely inaccessible to lower caste communities. While upper caste families could access trained physicians and medical treatments, lower caste communities were excluded from formal medical care and forced to rely on folk remedies and untrained healers. Exclusion from professional medicine. The medical profession was dominated by upper caste practitioners who served primarily upper caste patients. Lower caste individuals were considered too impure to be treated by high-status physicians, and their poverty meant they couldn't afford professional medical care even when it was theoretically available. This medical apartheid had deadly consequences during epidemics and medical emergencies. While upper caste communities received the best available treatments, lower caste communities were left to suffer and die without professional medical intervention. The differential access to medical care contributed to dramatically different survival rates between different caste communities. Folk medicine and dangerous treatments. Excluded from professional medicine, lower caste communities relied on folk healers and traditional remedies that range from harmless to actively dangerous. Archaeological evidence from lower caste burial sites shows evidence of medical treatments that probably caused more harm than good, including crude surgical procedures, toxic plant medicines, and ritual treatments that delayed or prevented effective care. The reliance on folk medicine also meant that lower caste communities had no access to the medical knowledge that was being developed and refined in upper caste medical traditions. Advances in surgery, pharmacology, and diagnostic techniques remain confined to upper caste practitioners and patients. Life expectancy, the ultimate measure of inequality. Perhaps the most stark measure of inequality in ancient Indian society was the dramatic difference in life expectancy between different caste groups. While upper caste individuals might live into their 50s or 60s, lower caste life expectancy was often less than 30 years. Infant and child mortality. The greatest difference in survival rates occurred during infancy and childhood. While upper caste families could provide adequate nutrition, clean water, and medical care for their children, lower caste children face malnutrition, contaminated water, dangerous living conditions, and exclusion from medical care. Archaeological analysis of burial sites reveals infant mortality rates in lower caste communities that approached 50% or higher. Many children who survived infancy died during childhood from preventable diseases that were treatable in upper caste communities but fatal in lower caste settlements. Adult mortality and occupational hazards. Adults in lower caste communities faced occupational hazards, environmental dangers, and health problems that significantly reduced their life expectancy. The dangerous occupations assigned to lower caste workers, mining, metalworking, construction, waste disposal, involve regular exposure to toxic substances, physical injuries, and health hazards that cause premature death. The combination of malnutrition, poor living conditions, occupational hazards, and exclusion from medical care created a perfect storm of factors that kept lower caste life expectancy dramatically below that of upper caste communities. The human cost of inequality. The living conditions of lower caste communities in ancient India represent one of history's most systematic examples of human degradation and social oppression. Millions of people lived and died in conditions that barely sustained life, their potential wasted, and their dignity systematically destroyed by a social system that treated them as less than human. Understanding these conditions isn't just a matter of historical interest. It's essential for comprehending how systems of oppression function and endure. The caste system succeeded in maintaining itself for millennia partly because it created conditions that made resistance difficult or impossible for the majority of the population. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about the golden age of ancient India, remember the millions of people who lived in mud huts on the margins of cities, who drank contaminated water and ate inadequate food, who worked dangerous jobs for minimal pay, and who died young from preventable diseases, all while being told that their suffering was divinely ordained and spiritually beneficial. Their stories are as much a part of ancient Indian history as the temples and texts that receive more attention, and their experiences deserve to be remembered and understood. Part 4. The devastating plight of women. Half of humanity condemned to subjugation. If the caste system created a hierarchy of human worth based on birth, the treatment of women in ancient India created another layer of oppression that affected roughly half the population regardless of their caste status. While upper caste women enjoyed some privileges relative to lower caste women, all women in ancient Indian society faced systematic subordination that reduced them to property, breeding stock, and sources of family honor or shame. The romanticized image of ancient India as a civilization that revered the feminine divine stands in stark contrast to the brutal reality faced by actual women, whose lives were characterized by control, exploitation, and violence from birth to death. The status of women in ancient India wasn't simply a matter of cultural difference or historical context. It represented a comprehensive system of gender-based oppression that destroyed individual autonomy, wasted human potential, and caused immeasurable suffering. Understanding the system is crucial for grasping the full extent of social oppression in ancient Indian civilization, and recognizing how idealized narratives can obscure systematic human rights violations. Child marriage, stealing childhood and destroying lives. Perhaps no practice better illustrates the systematic dehumanization of women in ancient India than child marriage. The routine marriage of girls who were often barely past infancy to adult men they had never met. This was an occasional aberration or a practice limited to certain regions or classes. It was a normal, expected, and religiously sanctioned way that families disposed of their female children. The religious and social justification. Ancient texts like the Manusmriti explicitly mandated that girls should be married before puberty, with some prescribing marriage as early as 8 years old or even younger. The justification for this horrific practice combined religious doctrine with patriarchal control. Girls were considered inherently impure and dangerous, and only through marriage could they be properly controlled and made spiritually acceptable. The religious establishment taught that unmarried girls brought shame and spiritual pollution to their families. The concept of Kanyadan, the gift of a virgin, was presented as one of the most meritorious religious acts a father could perform, but this gift involved handing over a child to an adult stranger for sexual and domestic exploitation. Archaeological evidence supports the prevalence of child marriage through skeletal analysis of ancient burial sites. Remains of young girls show evidence of pregnancy and childbirth at ages that would be considered child abuse by any modern standard. Pelvic bones of girls as young as 12 or 13 show the stress fractures and deformations associated with pregnancy and childbirth, indicating that sexual activity and reproduction began immediately after these ceremonial marriages. The physical and psychological trauma. The physical consequences of child marriage were devastating and often fatal. Girls who were sexually active and pregnant before their bodies had fully developed faced enormous risks during pregnancy and childbirth. Skeletal remains from ancient burial sites consistently show evidence of deaths during childbirth among very young females, with some estimates suggesting that complications from early pregnancy and childbirth were leading causes of death for adolescent girls. The psychological trauma of child marriage is harder to document through archaeological evidence, but historical accounts and literature provide glimpses of the terror and confusion experienced by young girls who were suddenly removed from their families and subjected to sexual and domestic violence by adult strangers. These girls had no preparation for marriage beyond basic domestic skills, no understanding of sexuality or reproduction, and no emotional or psychological resources for dealing with their new roles as wives and mothers. The practice of child marriage also destroyed any possibility of education or personal development for girls. Once married, girls were expected to focus exclusively on serving their husbands and producing children. Any interests, talents, or aspirations they might have had were considered irrelevant or dangerous distractions from their designated roles. Economic motivations and family strategies. While child marriage was justified through religious doctrine, it was often motivated by economic considerations that treated girls as financial burdens to be disposed of as quickly as possible. Families viewed daughters as temporary members who would eventually belong to other families, making investment in their well-being or development seem wasteful. Early marriage also served to minimize the dowry obligations that families face when marrying off daughters. Younger girls could be married with smaller dowries than older ones, creating perverse incentives for families to arrange marriages as early as possible. This economic logic treated children as commodities whose value decreased with age, creating pressure for ever earlier marriages. Historical records from various kingdoms show legal and administrative recognition of child marriage through documents recording marriages of girls described as not yet having reached puberty or similar euphemisms. These official records reveal that child marriage wasn't a hidden or shameful practice, but an openly acknowledged social institution supported by religious and political authorities. The dowry system, economic exploitation, and family destruction. The dowry system represented another mechanism through which the treatment of women devastated families and perpetuated cycles of poverty and desperation. Unlike bride price systems where the groom's family compensates the bride's family, the dowry system required the bride's family to pay the groom's family for taking their daughter, essentially paying others to accept what they portrayed as their burden. The economic burden and its consequences. The dowry system created crushing economic pressure on families with daughters. Parents were expected to provide not just money and goods at the time of marriage, but often continuing payments throughout their daughter's married life. These demands could bankrupt families, force them into debt bondage, or drive them to desperate measures to acquire the necessary resources. Archaeological evidence from ancient households reveals the extent of dowry obligations through artifact assemblages found in homes. Excavations of upper caste residences show accumulations of luxury goods, jewelry, metalwork, textiles, and other valuables that were likely assembled as dowry payments. The quality and quantity of these goods indicate that substantial family wealth was regularly transferred through dowry payments. Administrative records carved in stone and preserved on metal plates document the legal framework surrounding dowry obligations. These records show that dowry arrangements were often complex multi-generational contracts that could obligate families for decades after the initial marriage. Some contracts included provisions for additional payments upon the birth of children, during festivals, or when the groom achieved certain social or economic milestones. Infanticide and gender-based violence. The economic burden of the dowry system created powerful incentives for families to eliminate female children before they became financial liabilities. While direct archaeological evidence of female infanticide is difficult to identify, demographic analysis of ancient burial sites reveals suspicious patterns in the ratio of male to female children that suggest systematic elimination of girls. Skeletal remains from some ancient sites show male-to-female ratios that deviate significantly from natural birth patterns, with some areas showing 2 or 3 male burials for every female burial among children. While some of this disparity might be explained by differential burial practices or preservation issues, the consistent pattern across multiple sites suggests that female infanticide was practiced widely enough to affect demographic patterns. Historical texts and legal codes contain references to female infanticide that suggest it was common enough to require legal regulation, though these regulations were often ineffective. The Arthashastra, an ancient treatise on statecraft, contains provisions attempting to prevent female infanticide while simultaneously acknowledging that it was a widespread practice. Continued exploitation after marriage. The dowry system didn't end with marriage. It created ongoing vulnerabilities for women throughout their married lives. Husbands and in-laws could make additional dowry demands at any time, and failure to meet these demands could result in harassment, violence, or abandonment of the wife. Archaeological evidence from ancient domestic contexts reveals a precarious position of married women through analysis of household artifacts and spatial arrangements. Many excavated homes show evidence of spaces where women lived in conditions significantly inferior to those of male family members, suggesting their subordinate and vulnerable status within their own households. Legal texts document the various ways that married women could be exploited through the dowry system. Women who failed to bring adequate dowries or whose families couldn't meet ongoing demands could be returned to their natal families in disgrace, subjected to physical violence, or even killed with limited legal consequences for their husbands or in-laws. Sati, the ultimate expression of women's disposability. Perhaps no practice more dramatically illustrates the systematic devaluation of women's lives in ancient India than sati, the immolation of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. While some modern apologists attempt to portray sati as a voluntary expression of devotion, historical evidence reveals it as a practice rooted in economic exploitation, social control, and a fundamental belief that women's lives had no independent value. The religious and economic rationale. The religious justification for sati drew on concepts of wifely duty and spiritual purification, but the economic motivations were often more immediate and practical. Widows represented economic burdens on families that had already fulfilled their obligations by providing dowries. By eliminating widows through sati, families could avoid the ongoing costs of supporting women who were no longer considered useful for reproductive purposes. Archaeological evidence of sati practices comes from several sources, including memorial stones, sati stones, that commemorate women who died on funeral pyres. These monuments, found throughout ancient India, provide evidence that sati was practiced widely enough to merit permanent commemoration. The inscriptions on these stones often emphasize the honor brought to families by women who performed sati, revealing the social pressure that made this practice virtually mandatory for many widows. Excavations of ancient cremation sites occasionally reveal evidence consistent with sati practices, including multiple sets of human remains in single funeral contexts and patterns of burning that suggest some individuals were alive when cremation began. While such evidence is rare and difficult to interpret definitively, it provides physical confirmation of practices that are well documented in textual sources. Social pressure and coercion. Despite modern attempts to portray sati as voluntary, historical evidence reveals the enormous social pressure that made refusal virtually impossible for many widows. Widows who refused to perform sati faced social ostracism, economic destitution, and often physical violence from family members and community leaders who viewed their survival as shameful. The social construction of widowhood in ancient India made life after a husband's death so miserable that death might seem preferable. Widows were considered unlucky and polluting, barred from participating in social and religious activities, and often treated as pariahs within their own families. They were expected to live in permanent mourning, wearing only white clothes, eating minimal food, and avoiding all forms of pleasure or comfort. Legal texts reveal that widows had virtually no property rights or economic independence. Upon their husbands' deaths, widows typically lost access to family property, income sources, and social support systems. This economic vulnerability made them dependent on the charity of relatives who often viewed them as burdens and encouraged them to choose death over continued dependence. The mechanism of enforcement. The social mechanisms that enforced sati were sophisticated and comprehensive. Communities developed elaborate rituals around widow immolation that made refusal seem like betrayal of religious duty and family honor. These rituals often included periods of preparation during which widows were isolated from potential sources of support and subjected to intensive pressure from religious authorities and family members. Historical accounts describe the physical arrangements for sati ceremonies, including construction of funeral pyres designed to make escape impossible once the ceremony began. Some accounts describe widows being drugged or physically restrained to prevent them from fleeing once they realized the reality of what was about to happen to them. The community celebration that often accompanied sati ceremonies served to normalize and glorify the practice, while making individual resistance seem like personal failure rather than reasonable self-preservation. Women who attempted to escape from sati ceremonies faced not just personal shame, but community-wide condemnation that could affect their entire extended families. Legal rights. The fiction of protection. The legal system in ancient India offered women virtually no meaningful rights or protections, despite occasional textual references to respect for feminine virtue or motherhood. The reality was a comprehensive legal framework that treated women as property to be owned, transferred, and disposed of by male relatives and authorities. Property and inheritance rights. Women in ancient India had essentially no property rights independent of their relationships to men. They could not own land, engage in business transactions, or inherit property in their own right. Even the jewelry and personal items they received as dowry technically belonged to their husbands' families and could be confiscated or redistributed at will. Archaeological evidence supports this legal reality through analysis of burial goods and household artifacts. Female burials consistently contain fewer and less valuable grave goods than male burials of similar social status, suggesting that women accumulated less personal property during their lifetimes. When valuable items are found in female burials, they often show signs of having been broken or altered, possibly indicating that they were damaged to prevent their use by heirs. Legal texts like the Manusmriti explicitly state that women cannot independently own property and must always be under control of male guardians. First fathers, then husbands, then sons. This legal dependency made women vulnerable to economic exploitation and abuse throughout their lives, with no recourse to independent resources or legal protection. Marriage and divorce rights. Marriage in ancient India was understood as a transaction between families rather than a relationship between individuals, and women had no voice in these arrangements. They could not choose their husbands, negotiate the terms of their marriages, or seek divorce even in cases of extreme abuse or abandonment. The absence of divorce rights trapped women in marriages that might involve violence, neglect, or abandonment with no legal recourse. Historical texts contain references to wives being abandoned by husbands who left for military campaigns, trade expeditions, or religious pilgrimages, but these women had no legal mechanisms for dissolving their marriages or remarrying. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts reveals the vulnerability of married women through analysis of household spatial arrangements and artifact distributions. Many excavated homes show evidence of gender-segregated spaces that would have isolated women from potential sources of support or protection, making them vulnerable to domestic violence and exploitation. Legal testimony and court access. Women's testimony in legal proceedings was given less weight than men's testimony, and in many cases, women were prohibited from testifying altogether. This legal discrimination meant that women who were victims of crimes had little recourse through official channels, while crimes against women were often treated as property damage against their male relatives rather than personal injuries. Legal texts reveal that crimes against women were typically punished according to the social status of their male relatives rather than the severity of harm to the women themselves. The rape of an upper-caste woman might be severely punished because it damaged her family's honor, while violence against lower-caste women received minimal legal attention because they were considered less valuable property. The legal system's failure to protect women created a culture of impunity around gender-based violence. Men who committed crimes against women faced minimal legal consequences, especially if their victims were from lower social strata or lacked powerful male protectors. Ritual pollution, biological functions as social control. Ancient Indian society treated normal female biological functions, menstruation and childbirth, as sources of ritual pollution that required isolation and purification. This treatment of natural biological processes as spiritually contaminating served to reinforce women's subordinate status while creating additional mechanisms for social control and psychological oppression. Menstrual isolation and its consequences. Menstruating women were considered so polluting that they were required to isolate themselves from normal social activities, often in separate living spaces with minimal comfort or amenities. This monthly isolation meant that women lost several days of productive activity each month and were regularly reminded of their supposed spiritual inferiority. Archaeological evidence of menstrual isolation practices comes from excavations of domestic spaces that include small, poorly appointed rooms or structures that appear to have been designed for temporary isolation. These spaces typically lack the amenities found in other parts of the house and show evidence of minimal use, consistent with their function as isolation chambers. The psychological impact of monthly isolation cannot be understated. Women were taught that their natural biological functions made them spiritually dangerous and socially unacceptable. This conditioning reinforced broader messages about female inferiority and helped ensure that women internalized their subordinate status as natural and appropriate. Postpartum isolation and vulnerability. The period following childbirth was also considered a time of extreme pollution, requiring extended isolation. New mothers were often confined for weeks or months after giving birth, separated from normal social activities and support systems during a time when they were physically and emotionally vulnerable. Archaeological analysis of infant and maternal mortality patterns reveals the deadly consequences of postpartum isolation practices. Skeletal remains from ancient burial sites show high rates of maternal and infant mortality that may have been exacerbated by isolation practices that prevented new mothers from accessing help during medical emergencies. The isolation of new mothers also affected infant care and child development. Women who were confined during postpartum periods had limited access to community knowledge about childcare, medical assistance during infant illnesses, and social support that might have improved outcomes for both mothers and children. The control mechanism. The treatment of female biological functions as pollution served multiple control functions beyond simple religious observance. It created regular periods when women were excluded from economic, social, and religious activities, limiting their ability to accumulate influence or build independent relationships. The pollution concept also provided religious justification for excluding women from education, religious ceremonies, and other activities that might have provided them with knowledge or social connections that could challenge their subordinate status. Women who were regularly reminded of their spiritual inferiority were less likely to question social arrangements that disadvantaged them. The intersectionality of oppression. The oppression of women in ancient India didn't exist in isolation, but intersected with caste, class, and other forms of social hierarchy to create multiple layers of disadvantage. Lower caste women face not only gender-based oppression, but also the additional burdens of caste discrimination, economic exploitation, and social exclusion. Caste and gender intersections. Lower caste women face sexual exploitation from upper caste men with virtual impunity. The legal and social systems provided no protection for these women, who were considered fair game for upper caste sexual predators. This exploitation was often justified through religious and social doctrines that portrayed lower caste women as inherently impure and therefore appropriate targets for sexual violence. Archaeological evidence of this exploitation is difficult to identify directly, but demographic analysis of ancient burial sites sometimes reveals patterns consistent with systematic sexual exploitation. Some lower caste burial areas show unusually high numbers of children with physical characteristics suggesting mixed caste parentage, indicating widespread sexual exploitation of lower caste women by upper caste men. The children born from these exploited relationships face their own forms of discrimination and exclusion, often being relegated to even lower social positions than their mothers. This created additional incentives for lower caste families to try to protect their daughters through early marriage or other strategies that might reduce their vulnerability to upper caste predation. Economic exploitation of women's labor. Women's labor was systematically devalued and exploited across all social levels. Women performed essential economic activities: food production, textile manufacture, childcare, household maintenance. But this work was considered natural female duty rather than economically valuable labor deserving of compensation or recognition. Archaeological evidence from ancient production sites reveals the extent of women's economic contributions through analysis of tools, workspaces, and production residues. Women were clearly involved in textile production, food processing, pottery manufacture, and other essential economic activities, but these contributions were invisible in official economic records and legal frameworks. The systematic devaluation of women's work served to maintain their economic dependence on male relatives while ensuring that their contributions to family and community wealth went unrecognized and uncompensated. This economic exploitation was justified through ideological frameworks that portrayed women's work as natural expressions of feminine nature rather than valuable economic activities. The human cost of gender oppression. The systematic oppression of women in ancient India represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of gender-based social control. The practices described here, child marriage, dowry demands, widow immolation, legal exclusion, and ritual isolation, created a system that treated half of humanity as property to be exploited rather than people deserving of dignity and autonomy. The human cost of this system was enormous. Millions of women lived and died without ever experiencing basic human freedoms: the right to choose their own partners, pursue their own interests, control their own bodies, or make decisions about their own lives. Their potential contributions to society were wasted, their talents ignored, and their suffering dismissed as natural and appropriate. Understanding this history isn't about condemning ancient cultures or peoples, but about recognizing how systems of oppression function and endure. The gender-based oppression of ancient India succeeded in maintaining itself for millennia partly because it was justified through religious doctrine, supported by legal frameworks, and reinforced through daily practices that normalize the subordination of women. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about the respect for feminine divinity in ancient Indian culture, remember the millions of actual women who were married as children, burned alive as widows, excluded from education and property rights, and treated as ritual pollutants for their natural biological functions. Their stories are as much a part of ancient Indian history as the temples dedicated to goddesses, and their experiences deserve to be remembered without romantic embellishment or historical amnesia. The systematic oppression of women in ancient India was an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise admirable civilization. It was a central organizing principle that shaped every aspect of social life. Recognizing this reality is essential for understanding both the past and the ongoing struggle for gender equality that continues today. Part 5. Primitive Medicine and Deadly Diseases. When death was always at the door. While ancient Indian texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita are celebrated today for their sophisticated medical theories and surgical techniques, the harsh reality is that these advanced treatments were available only to a tiny elite. For the vast majority of the population in ancient India, medical care was primitive, dangerous, and often based more on superstition than science. Disease was a constant companion. Epidemics regularly decimated communities, and death, particularly for children, was so common that it shaped every aspect of family life and social organization. The romanticized narrative of ancient Indian medicine focuses on the remarkable theoretical knowledge preserved in classical texts, while ignoring the brutal reality that most people lived and died without access to effective medical treatment. Understanding this gap between medical theory and practical healthcare reveals another dimension of the harsh inequality that characterized ancient Indian society and helps explain why life expectancy remained so devastatingly low for so many centuries. The germ theory gap, fighting invisible enemies blindfolded. Perhaps the most fundamental limitation of ancient Indian medicine was the complete absence of germ theory. The understanding that many diseases are caused by microscopic organisms that can be transmitted between people. Without this crucial knowledge, medical practitioners and ordinary people alike were essentially fighting a war against invisible enemies while blindfolded. Contamination without understanding. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements reveals the devastating consequences of this ignorance. Excavations consistently show contaminated water sources located dangerously close to waste disposal areas, food storage facilities that would have promoted bacterial growth, and burial practices that could have spread infectious diseases throughout communities. Ancient Indian medical texts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of many disease symptoms and some effective treatments, but they consistently misidentify the causes of infectious diseases. Diseases that we now know are caused by bacteria, viruses, or parasites were attributed to imbalances of bodily humors, supernatural causes, or moral failings. This misunderstanding of disease causation led to treatment approaches that often made conditions worse rather than better. Patients with infectious diseases were sometimes treated with methods that would have promoted the spread of infection. Shared medical instruments, communal bathing facilities, and group treatments that brought sick and healthy people into close contact. Surgical practices without sterile technique. The Sushruta Samhita describes remarkably sophisticated surgical procedures, including cataract surgery, kidney stone removal, and even reconstructive surgery. However, these procedures were performed without any understanding of infection control or sterile technique. Archaeological finds of ancient surgical instruments show tools that were well crafted but would have been used repeatedly without proper sterilization. The absence of sterile technique meant that surgical procedures, even when performed skillfully, carried enormous risks of infection. Post-surgical infections were likely so common that surgery was reserved for only the most desperate cases. Many patients who survived the initial procedure probably died from infections that developed afterward. Skeletal remains from ancient burial sites occasionally show evidence of surgical procedures, including trepanation, skull drilling, and bone setting for fractures. However, many of these remains also show signs of infection around surgical sites, suggesting that post-operative complications were a major cause of death even when the surgery itself was technically successful. Superstition masquerading as medicine. In the absence of scientific understanding, much of what passed for medical treatment in ancient India was based on religious beliefs, superstitions, and magical thinking. While some folk remedies contained genuinely effective compounds, many treatments were not only useless but actively harmful. Religious ritual as medical treatment. Many illnesses were attributed to supernatural causes, angry deities, evil spirits, or karmic consequences of past actions. This led to treatments that focus on religious ritual rather than addressing the physical causes of disease. Patients might be subjected to elaborate purification ceremonies, forced pilgrimages, or expensive religious offerings while their medical conditions went untreated. Archaeological evidence of these ritual treatments comes from temple sites and domestic contexts where votive offerings associated with healing requests have been found. These artifacts, miniature body parts made of metal or clay, for example, indicate that people regularly sought divine intervention for medical problems rather than practical treatment. The emphasis on supernatural causation was particularly devastating for mental health conditions. People suffering from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, epilepsy, or other neurological conditions were often treated as possessed by evil spirits. Treatments included exorcism rituals, physical restraint, and social isolation that would have worsened their conditions considerably. Dangerous folk remedies. Many traditional treatments involve substances that were actively toxic or procedures that cause additional harm. Archaeological analysis of ancient pharmacy sites reveals evidence of preparations containing heavy metals like mercury and lead, which would have caused poisoning rather than healing. Some folk remedies involve procedures that were extremely dangerous, such as the application of heated metal instruments to treat various conditions, the ingestion of animal parts or excreta believed to have magical properties, or bloodletting procedures that could have caused fatal blood loss or infection. The persistence of these harmful treatments was reinforced by survivorship bias. People who recovered despite receiving dangerous treatments were seen as proof of the treatment's effectiveness, while those who died were often blamed for insufficient faith or hidden moral failings. Epidemic devastation. When death came in waves. Without understanding of disease transmission or effective public health measures, ancient Indian communities were defenseless against epidemic diseases that periodically swept through the population, killing thousands and leaving lasting trauma in their wake. Cholera, the waterborne killer. Cholera was perhaps the most devastating epidemic disease in ancient India, spreading rapidly through communities via contaminated water sources. The disease's symptoms, severe dehydration, vomiting, and diarrhea, were well documented in ancient medical texts, but the treatments prescribed were often ineffective or harmful. Archaeological evidence of cholera epidemics comes from mass burial sites where large numbers of people were interred simultaneously, suggesting community-wide mortality events. These burial sites often show evidence of hasty interment, with bodies buried in shallow graves or mass pits that suggest communities were overwhelmed by the scale of death. The social impact of cholera epidemics was enormous. Historical accounts describe entire villages being abandoned after cholera outbreaks, with survivors fleeing to escape what they believed was supernatural punishment. These population movements often spread the disease to new areas, creating waves of infection that could devastate entire regions. Smallpox, the face of death. Smallpox was another major killer in ancient India, particularly devastating to children and young adults. The disease was well known enough to be personified as a goddess, Shitala Mata, who required appeasement through ritual offerings and ceremonies. Skeletal remains from ancient burial sites occasionally show evidence consistent with smallpox infection, including characteristic bone lesions that could develop in severe cases. More commonly, the age distribution of burials during certain periods suggests epidemic mortality patterns consistent with smallpox outbreaks. The religious response to smallpox, treating it as divine punishment requiring ritual appeasement rather than medical intervention, meant that communities often responded to outbreaks in ways that promoted rather than prevented transmission. Communal ceremonies and pilgrimages during epidemics would brought infected and susceptible people together, accelerating the spread of disease. Bubonic plague, the Great Mortality. While most famous plague outbreaks occurred in medieval Europe, bubonic plague also struck ancient India with devastating effect. The disease, spread by fleas from infected rodents, could kill up to 60% of those infected and spread rapidly through densely populated areas. Archaeological evidence of plague in ancient India includes mass burial sites and sudden abandonment of settlements that suggest catastrophic mortality events. Some archaeological sites show evidence of rapid cultural change or population replacement that might indicate plague-induced social collapse. The lack of understanding about plague transmission meant that communities had no effective strategies for prevention or control. People often fled plague-affected areas, inadvertently carrying the disease to new locations and ensuring its continued spread. The tragedy of childhood, when half never grew up. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medical conditions in ancient India was the catastrophically high rate of infant and child mortality. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many communities, up to 50% or more children died before reaching their 5th birthday. The vulnerable years. The first years of life were particularly dangerous. Infants faced risks from birth complications, infectious diseases, malnutrition, and accidents, with little effective medical intervention available. Archaeological analysis of ancient burial sites consistently shows large numbers of infant and child burials, often outnumbering adult burials. The high rate of infant mortality had profound effects on family structure and social organization. Parents could not assume that children would survive to adulthood, leading to practices like having many children in hopes that some would survive, or delaying emotional attachment until children reached certain ages. Birth complications were a major cause of both infant and maternal mortality. Without understanding of sterile technique, cesarean sections, or other obstetric interventions, difficult births often resulted in the death of both mother and child. Archaeological evidence shows high rates of maternal mortality among young women, consistent with deaths during childbirth. Childhood diseases as population control. Common childhood diseases like measles, whooping cough, and diarrheal infections were major killers in ancient India. Without effective treatments or preventive measures, these diseases regularly swept through communities, killing large numbers of children. The absence of vaccination or other preventive measures meant that children were completely vulnerable to infectious diseases. Archaeological evidence suggests that epidemic diseases often had the greatest impact on children, who lacked both acquired immunity and the physical reserves to survive serious illness. Malnutrition made children even more vulnerable to infectious diseases. Archaeological analysis of child skeletal remains consistently shows evidence of nutritional deficiencies that would have compromised immune function and increased susceptibility to infection. Surgery without mercy. Operations in an age of agony. While ancient Indian surgical texts describe sophisticated procedures, the reality of surgery in an era without effective anesthesia or infection control was a nightmare of pain, trauma, and frequent death. The absence of effective anesthesia. Ancient Indian medical texts mention various substances used to reduce pain during surgery, including alcohol, opium preparations, and herbal mixtures. However, these substances were often inadequate for major surgical procedures, meaning that patients endured operations while fully conscious and in excruciating pain. Archaeological evidence of surgical procedures includes skeletal remains showing evidence of bone cutting, drilling, and other interventions. Some of these remains show evidence of healing, indicating that patients survived the immediate procedure, but many show no signs of healing, suggesting death during or shortly after surgery. The psychological trauma of surgery performed without adequate anesthesia was enormous. Many patients probably died from shock and trauma, even when the surgical technique was correct. The fear of surgical procedures was so great that surgery was likely reserved for only the most desperate cases, where death seemed certain without intervention. Post-surgical complications. Even patients who survived the immediate trauma of surgery faced enormous risks from post-operative complications. Without understanding of infection control, surgical wounds frequently became infected, leading to sepsis and death. Archaeological evidence suggests that surgical procedures often had poor outcomes. Skeletal remains showing evidence of surgery frequently also show signs of infection, incomplete healing, or other complications that would cause ongoing pain and disability even when patients survived. The lack of effective post-operative care meant that surgical patients were largely left to heal on their own. Without antibiotics, proper wound care, or pain management, recovery from surgery was a prolonged ordeal with uncertain outcomes. The social impact of medical helplessness. The inability to effectively treat disease and injury had profound effects on ancient Indian society, shaping everything from religious beliefs to family structures to economic systems. Disease as divine punishment. The lack of effective medical treatments led to widespread belief that disease was a form of divine punishment for moral failings. This belief system had devastating psychological effects on patients and families, adding guilt and shame to the burden of physical suffering. The interpretation of disease as moral failing also affected treatment approaches. Resources that might have been devoted to practical medical care were instead directed toward religious ceremonies and ritual purification designed to address supposed spiritual causes of illness. Economic impact of illness. In a society where most people lived at subsistence levels, illness could be economically catastrophic. The inability to work during sickness, combined with the cost of whatever medical treatment was available, could drive families into debt bondage or starvation. Archaeological evidence from ancient households sometimes shows sudden changes in material culture that might indicate economic collapse following illness or death of breadwinners. These changes, from quality goods to inferior substitutes, from varied diets to monotonous subsistence foods, suggest the economic vulnerability that illness created. The reality behind the reputation. While ancient Indian medical texts represent remarkable intellectual achievements for their time, the gap between medical theory and practical healthcare was enormous. The sophisticated knowledge preserved in classical texts was accessible only to a tiny elite, while the vast majority of the population lived and died with primitive medical care that was often more harmful than helpful. Understanding this reality helps explain why life expectancy remained so low in ancient India despite the existence of advanced medical knowledge. It also reveals another dimension of inequality that characterized ancient Indian society. Even something as basic as effective medical treatment was distributed according to social status rather than medical need. The next time someone points to ancient Indian medical texts as evidence of advanced healthcare in the past, remember the millions of people who died from preventable diseases, the children who never reached adulthood, the women who died in childbirth, and the patients who endured surgery without anesthesia. Their suffering was real, and their stories deserve to be part of any honest assessment of medical care in ancient India. The development of modern medicine, with its understanding of germ theory, anesthesia, antibiotics, and surgical sterility, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. By understanding how people lived and died before these advances, we can better appreciate both how far we've come and how precious our current medical capabilities truly are. Part 6. Constant Violence and War. A subcontinent drenched in blood. The romanticized image of ancient India often portrays it as a land of peaceful sages and enlightened rulers guided by Dharmic principles of nonviolence and righteous governance. This idealized narrative conveniently ignores one of the most defining characteristics of ancient Indian civilization: the relentless, brutal warfare that characterized virtually every period and region. Far from being occasional disruptions to an otherwise peaceful society, wars were the normal state of affairs in ancient India, a constant backdrop of violence that shaped every aspect of life for millions of people. Archaeological evidence reveals a subcontinent where fortified cities were the norm rather than the exception, where weapons were among the most commonly produced artifacts, and where mass graves tell stories of systematic slaughter that occurred with terrifying regularity. The ancient Indian political system was fundamentally predicated on violence, with rulers maintaining power through military force and expanding their territories through conquest and devastation. Understanding this reality of constant warfare is essential for grasping the true nature of life in ancient India and recognizing how far removed the historical reality was from modern romanticized narratives. The mandala theory, a system built for war. Ancient Indian political theory, codified in texts like Kaudya's Arthashastra, explicitly recognized that warfare was the natural state of relations between kingdoms. The mandala theory of statecraft assumed that neighboring kingdoms were natural enemies, while distant kingdoms were potential allies against common neighbors. This theoretical framework created a political system where peace was always temporary and war was always imminent. Territorial fragmentation and resource competition. The political geography of ancient India was characterized by extreme fragmentation, with dozens or hundreds of small kingdoms, principalities, and tribal territories competing for control over limited resources. Archaeological surveys reveal the remnants of fortification systems that divided the subcontinent into a patchwork of defended territories, each prepared for constant warfare with its neighbors. Competition for fertile agricultural land was particularly intense, as control over productive territories meant the difference between prosperity and starvation for entire populations. River valleys. which provided both fertile soil and transportation routes, were especially contested areas where kingdoms regularly fought battles that could determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of people. Trade routes represented another constant source of conflict. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Indian cities invested enormous resources in fortification systems designed to protect valuable trade goods and commercial activities. The wealth generated by trade made cities attractive targets for conquest, while the strategic importance of controlling trade routes motivated rulers to wage wars of expansion and consolidation. The economics of warfare. Warfare in ancient India was not just about political dominance. It was a fundamental part of the economic system. Successful military campaigns could provide rulers with enormous wealth through plunder, tribute, and the acquisition of new territories and populations. This economic incentive for warfare created a vicious cycle where military success funded further military expansion, while military failure often led to economic collapse and vulnerability to conquest. Archaeological evidence from ancient treasuries and palaces reveals the extent to which warfare shaped economic priorities. Weapons and military equipment represent significant portions of the material culture at most ancient Indian sites, suggesting that substantial portions of available resources were consistently devoted to military purposes rather than civilian welfare or development. The maintenance of professional armies required enormous resources, forcing rulers to extract tribute and taxes from their subjects to fund military activities. This military taxation often pushed civilian populations to the brink of subsistence, creating additional social tensions that could erupt into internal conflicts and rebellions. Conscription, the poor man's fate. The romantic image of ancient Indian warfare often focuses on heroic Kshatriya warriors fighting honorable battles according to Dharmic principles. The reality was far more brutal, with armies composed primarily of peasants and lower caste individuals who were forcibly conscripted into military service with little regard for their personal welfare or survival. Forced recruitment from vulnerable populations. Lower caste communities bore the brunt of military conscription, as rulers viewed them as expendable resources to be consumed in warfare. Archaeological analysis of ancient battlefields reveals skeletal remains that show evidence of malnutrition and poor health even before death in combat, suggesting that soldiers were drawn from the most vulnerable segments of society. The process of conscription was often violent and coercive. Administrative texts describe military officials conducting raids on villages to capture men for military service. With little regard for the economic or social disruption this caused to rural communities. Families who lost their primary breadwinners to conscription faced immediate threats of starvation and destitution. Young men from lower caste families had virtually no legal recourse to avoid military service. Unlike upper caste individuals who might secure exemptions through religious obligations or economic arrangements, lower caste conscripts were considered property of the state to be used and disposed of as military necessity required. Training and equipment disparities. Conscripted soldiers received minimal training and inferior equipment compared to professional warriors from higher castes. Archaeological finds from ancient armories show clear quality distinctions between weapons and armor, with the best equipment reserved for elite warriors while common soldiers were equipped with crude, mass-produced weapons that offered minimal protection. The disparity in military equipment reflected broader social inequalities but had deadly consequences on battlefields. Well-equipped elite warriors had significant advantages in combat, while poorly equipped conscripts were essentially sacrificial fodder designed to absorb enemy attacks and create opportunities for more valuable soldiers. Training for conscripted soldiers was often limited to basic weapon handling and formation fighting. Unlike professional warriors who received extensive combat training from childhood, conscripts were expected to learn military skills through experience, meaning that their early battles were essentially on-the-job training with fatal consequences for mistakes. The human cost of disposable soldiers. The treatment of conscripted soldiers as disposable resources had devastating effects on families and communities throughout ancient India. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements shows demographic patterns consistent with the regular removal of young men from the population, creating communities dominated by women, children, and elderly individuals. Mass burial sites associated with ancient battlefields reveal the scale of military casualties. These sites often contain hundreds or thousands of hastily buried remains, suggesting battles where entire units of conscripted soldiers were wiped out. The age and health profiles of these remains indicate that many casualties were very young men who had been recently recruited from civilian populations. The psychological trauma of forced military service affected not just the conscripts themselves, but entire communities. Historical accounts describe the grief and terror that accompanied military recruitment raids, with families attempting to hide their young men or flee to avoid conscription. These disruptions to community life had lasting effects on social cohesion and economic productivity. Systematic looting. War as economic enterprise. Ancient Indian warfare was characterized by systematic looting and plunder that went far beyond the seizure of military assets. Conquering armies regularly engaged in comprehensive pillaging that stripped defeated territories of wealth, resources, and anything else of value, leaving devastated populations to face starvation and destitution. Urban destruction and wealth extraction. Archaeological evidence from ancient cities reveals repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding that reflect the systematic looting that accompanied military conquests. Many urban sites show distinct archaeological layers representing periods of violent destruction, with burned buildings, scattered artifacts, and evidence of hasty abandonment. The looting of conquered cities was comprehensive and methodical. Armies targeted not just royal treasuries and temples, but also private homes, workshops, and storage facilities. Archaeological excavations show evidence of systematic searching and destruction, with floors torn up to locate hidden valuables and walls demolished to access concealed storage areas. Religious institutions were particular targets for looting, as temples and monasteries often accumulated substantial wealth through donations and religious activities. Archaeological evidence from destroyed temple complexes shows that looters were thorough and systematic, removing not just obvious valuables, but also architectural elements like decorative metalwork that could be melted down for their material value. Agricultural devastation. Military campaigns regularly involve the deliberate destruction of agricultural resources to deny them to enemies or to punish rebellious populations. This practice, known as scorched earth tactics, had devastating long-term consequences for civilian populations who depended on agriculture for survival. Archaeological evidence of agricultural destruction includes burned granaries, destroyed irrigation systems, and evidence of deliberate crop burning. These practices could create artificial famines that kill more people than direct military violence, as communities lost their food supplies and the infrastructure necessary for future agricultural production. The destruction of agricultural resources was often systematic and comprehensive. Armies would destroy seed stocks to prevent future planting, fill in wells and irrigation channels to prevent future cultivation, and kill or steal livestock to eliminate sources of animal protein and agricultural labor. Artisan and commercial targeting. Conquering armies also systematically targeted artisan workshops and commercial establishments, viewing skilled craftsmen and their tools as valuable resources to be captured or destroyed. Archaeological evidence from ancient craft centers shows repeated episodes of violent destruction, with tools scattered, workshops burned, and evidence of hasty evacuation. The capture or destruction of artisan skills had long-term economic consequences for conquered territories. Communities that lost their skilled craftsmen faced difficulties in maintaining basic tools, weapons, and other essential items. The economic disruption could last for generations, as traditional skills and knowledge were lost through violence and displacement. Commercial infrastructure was similarly targeted, with markets, warehouses, and transportation facilities regularly destroyed during military campaigns. This destruction of commercial networks had cascading effects throughout ancient Indian economies, disrupting trade relationships and economic activities far beyond the immediate areas of military conflict. Enslavement, the commodification of human beings. One of the most brutal aspects of ancient Indian warfare was the systematic enslavement of prisoners of war and civilian populations from conquered territories. This practice treated human beings as commodities to be captured, transported, and exploited, creating a vast system of forced labor that supported the economies of victorious kingdoms. The scale of war slavery. Legal texts like the Manusmriti and administrative records provide evidence of the systematic nature of war slavery in ancient India. These sources describe detailed regulations for the capture, transport, and sale of war prisoners, indicating that slavery was not an occasional byproduct of warfare, but an integral part of military and economic planning. Archaeological evidence suggests that war slavery operated on an enormous scale. Demographic analysis of ancient settlements shows patterns consistent with the large-scale removal of populations from defeated territories and their redistribution to victorious kingdoms. Some regions show evidence of sudden population increases that correspond to periods of military expansion, suggesting the importation of enslaved populations. The transportation of enslaved populations created its own forms of suffering and mortality. Historical accounts describe forced marches of captured populations across hundreds of miles, with inadequate food, water, and medical care. Many captives died during these forced relocations, creating archaeological evidence in the form of burial sites along known transportation routes. Categories of enslavement. Ancient Indian slavery systems created different categories of enslaved people based on their origins and intended uses. War captives might be assigned to agricultural labor, domestic service, mining operations, or other forms of forced work depending on their perceived value and the needs of their captors. Women and children captured during military campaigns faced particular vulnerabilities, as they were often separated from their families and subjected to sexual exploitation in addition to forced labor. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts sometimes reveals living arrangements consistent with the housing of enslaved individuals, including spaces that appear designed for confinement and control. Skilled artisans captured during warfare were particularly valuable, as they could be forced to practice their crafts for their new masters. This practice led to the forced transfer of technological knowledge and artistic traditions between regions, as conquered specialists were relocated to serve victorious kingdoms. The economics of human commodification. The systematic enslavement of war captives created entire economic sectors devoted to human trafficking. Archaeological evidence includes specialized facilities that appear designed for holding and processing captured populations, with features like restraining devices, guard posts, and mass housing facilities. The slave trade generated substantial profits for military leaders and kingdoms that engage in systematic capture and sale of human beings. Administrative records describe the taxation of slave transactions and the regulation of slave markets, indicating that human trafficking was a recognized and regulated economic activity. The use of enslaved labor allowed ancient Indian kingdoms to undertake massive construction projects and military campaigns that would not have been possible with free labor alone. Many of the architectural achievements that are celebrated today were built with enslaved labor captured through warfare, representing monuments to human suffering as much as artistic achievement. Civilian suffering, the forgotten victims. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of constant warfare in ancient India was the systematic suffering inflicted on civilian populations who had no control over military conflicts but bore the heaviest burden of their consequences. The ancient Indian approach to warfare showed little distinction between combatants and non-combatants, treating entire populations as legitimate targets for violence and exploitation. Siege warfare and urban suffering. Siege warfare was a common tactic in ancient Indian military campaigns, involving the systematic starvation and terrorization of urban populations to force surrender. Archaeological evidence from fortified cities shows defensive features designed to withstand extended sieges, but also evidence of the devastating consequences when these defenses failed. During sieges, civilian populations were trapped within city walls and subjected to deliberate starvation, as attacking armies prevented food and supplies from entering the city. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from siege contexts shows evidence of severe malnutrition and disease that reflects the horrific conditions experienced by trapped civilians. The psychological warfare tactics used during sieges included the deliberate infliction of terror through public executions, torture of captured offenders, and other forms of intimidation designed to break civilian morale. These tactics had lasting psychological effects on populations that survived siege warfare, creating trauma that could affect entire communities for generations. Refugee populations and displacement. Military campaigns regularly created massive refugee populations as civilians fled advancing armies or were deliberately displaced by conquerors seeking to depopulate rebellious territories. Archaeological evidence shows the remains of temporary refugee camps and settlement sites that indicate the large-scale movement of displaced populations. Refugee populations face enormous challenges in finding food, shelter, and safety while moving through territories affected by warfare. Many refugees died from starvation, disease, or violence during their displacement, creating archaeological evidence in the form of burial sites and abandoned campsites along known refugee routes. The long-term consequences of displacement were severe for affected populations. Refugees often lost their homes, property, social networks, and economic opportunities, becoming permanently marginalized populations dependent on charity or forced into exploitative labor relationships. Gender-based violence in warfare. Women face particular vulnerabilities during military campaigns, as conquering armies regularly engage in systematic sexual violence against female populations. While direct archaeological evidence of sexual violence is difficult to identify, demographic patterns and historical accounts provide clear evidence that rape and sexual exploitation were regular features of ancient Indian warfare. The capture and enslavement of women for sexual purposes was a recognized practice in ancient Indian warfare, with legal texts providing regulations for the treatment of captured women that implicitly acknowledged systematic sexual exploitation. This practice had devastating effects not just on individual victims, but on entire communities that lost their female members to violence and enslavement. Children were also vulnerable to specific forms of violence during military campaigns, including capture for enslavement, recruitment as child soldiers, or killing to prevent future resistance. The systematic targeting of children reflected the total warfare approach that characterized many ancient Indian military campaigns. The cycle of violence. The constant warfare that characterized ancient India created self-perpetuating cycles of violence that made peaceful resolution of conflicts increasingly difficult. Each act of military aggression created grievances that motivated revenge, while successful military campaigns created wealth and power that enabled further military expansion. Generational trauma and conflict. The traumatic effects of warfare affected entire generations, creating populations that were socialized to expect and prepare for violence. Archaeological evidence shows that most ancient Indian settlements invested enormous resources in fortification and defense, suggesting that entire communities lived in constant expectation of attack. The normalization of violence had profound effects on social development and cultural values. Children who grew up during periods of warfare were exposed to violence, displacement, and trauma that shaped their worldviews and behavioral patterns. These traumatized populations often perpetuated cycles of violence as they sought revenge for past injuries or attempted to prevent future attacks through preemptive aggression. Military technology and escalation. The constant warfare of ancient India drove continuous innovation in military technology, as kingdoms sought advantages over their enemies through superior weapons and tactics. Archaeological evidence shows the evolution of increasingly sophisticated and deadly weapon systems, from basic iron weapons to complex siege engines and specialized military equipment. The arms race that characterized ancient Indian warfare meant that military conflicts became increasingly destructive over time. Later periods show evidence of more comprehensive destruction, larger casualty numbers, and more systematic approaches to warfare that reflected the accumulated military knowledge and technological capabilities developed through centuries of constant conflict. The true cause of ancient Indian warfare. The constant warfare that characterized ancient India represents one of history's most sustained examples of systematic violence and its effects on civilian populations. The romantic narratives that focus on heroic warriors and Dharmic principles ignore the reality of millions of people who lived and died in a landscape of perpetual violence. Understanding this reality of constant warfare helps explain many other aspects of ancient Indian society. The rigid social hierarchies that were maintained through force, the economic systems that were designed to support military activities, and the religious and philosophical traditions that often serve to justify or rationalize systematic violence. The archaeological evidence is clear. Ancient India was not a peaceful land of spiritual enlightenment, but a subcontinent drenched in blood, where warfare was a normal state of affairs and civilian populations bore the devastating consequences of their rulers' military ambitions. The magnificent palaces and temples that we admire today were built with wealth extracted through systematic looting and maintained by populations that included vast numbers of war slaves. The next time someone speaks romantically about the peaceful wisdom of ancient Indian civilization, remember the millions of conscripted soldiers who died on battlefields far from home, the countless civilians who starved during sieges, the women and children enslaved during military campaigns, and entire communities that were destroyed and displaced by conquering armies. Their suffering was real. Their stories are part of ancient Indian history, and their experiences deserve to be remembered without romantic embellishment. The development of modern international law, humanitarian principles, and institutions designed to prevent warfare and protect civilian populations represents genuine progress in human civilization. By understanding the reality of constant warfare in ancient India, we can better appreciate how far humanity has advanced and recognize the importance of continued efforts to prevent the kind of systematic violence that characterized ancient civilizations. Part 7. Hunger and Chronic Food Insecurity. When survival hung on the whims of nature. In our modern world of global food distribution, agricultural technology, and emergency relief systems, it's difficult to comprehend the precarious relationship between survival and sustenance that characterized ancient Indian civilization. For the vast majority of the population, hunger was not an occasional hardship, but a constant companion that shaped every aspect of daily life, social organization, and human behavior. The difference between a good monsoon and a poor one could determine whether millions of people lived or died, and the specter of famine haunted every agricultural season. The romanticized narratives of ancient India often focus on the spiritual concept of simple living and minimal needs, presenting voluntary austerity as a virtue. But for most people in ancient India, minimal consumption wasn't a spiritual choice. It was a survival strategy necessitated by chronic food insecurity that kept entire populations perpetually on the brink of starvation. Understanding this reality of constant hunger helps explain many aspects of ancient Indian society that are otherwise difficult to comprehend, from the rigid preservation of social hierarchies to the desperate religious rituals designed to ensure agricultural success. The monsoon gamble, betting civilization on weather. Ancient Indian agriculture was almost entirely dependent on monsoon rains, creating a civilization that was fundamentally at the mercy of weather patterns beyond human control. This dependence on seasonal rainfall created a cycle of abundance and scarcity that could swing from surplus to famine within a single growing season, leaving populations vulnerable to catastrophic food shortages with little warning or preparation. The physics of starvation. The monsoon system that governs South Asian weather patterns is inherently variable and unpredictable. Modern meteorological studies show that monsoon failures occur regularly, with severe droughts affecting different regions approximately every decade and catastrophic failures happening every few decades. For ancient populations without weather forecasting, crop insurance, or emergency food reserves, this natural variability translated directly into mass starvation. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent of this agricultural vulnerability through analysis of ancient storage facilities and settlement patterns. Most ancient Indian cities and towns show evidence of elaborate granary systems designed to store surplus grain from good years. But these storage facilities were often inadequate for the scale of need during multi-year droughts. Excavations consistently reveal granaries that were provided only months of sustenance for their associated populations, far short of what would be needed during extended periods of crop failure. The relationship between rainfall and survival was so direct that ancient Indian texts are filled with detailed observations about weather patterns, astronomical correlations with rainfall, and religious rituals designed to ensure adequate precipitation. These texts reveal a civilization obsessed with weather forecasting and rain ceremonies because the alternative to adequate rainfall was mass death from starvation, regional variations, and systemic vulnerability. Different regions of ancient India experienced varying degrees of vulnerability to monsoon failure, but no area was immune to the threat of drought-induced famine. Archaeological surveys reveal that even regions with generally reliable rainfall maintain extensive irrigation systems and water storage facilities that indicate constant concern about water security. River valley civilizations, while generally more secure than rain-fed agricultural areas, face their own vulnerabilities when upstream droughts reduce river flows or when upstream conflicts disrupted water access. Archaeological evidence from ancient irrigation systems shows repeated episodes of abandonment and reconstruction that suggest regular disruption of water supplies due to natural disasters or human conflicts. Coastal regions that receive more reliable rainfall still face threats from cyclones, flooding, and saltwater intrusion that could destroy crops and contaminate freshwater supplies. The archaeological record shows evidence of storm damage, flood deposits, and abandoned settlements that indicate the vulnerability of even relatively favored agricultural areas. The cascade of agricultural failure. Monsoon failure didn't just affect the immediate growing season. It created cascading effects that could devastate agricultural productivity for years. Drought conditions killed livestock, depleted seed stocks, and forced farmers to consume seed grain that should have been saved for planting. Archaeological analysis of agricultural sites reveals episodes where entire farming systems collapsed and required decades to recover. The loss of livestock during droughts was particularly devastating because animals provided not just meat and dairy products, but also the draft power necessary for plowing and cultivation. Archaeological sites show evidence of mass animal die-offs during drought periods, with bone assemblages indicating the sudden death of large numbers of cattle, water buffalo, and other agricultural animals. The depletion of seed stocks during famines created long-term agricultural vulnerability even after monsoons returned. Farmers who had consumed their seed grain to survive immediate starvation couldn't plant crops when rains resumed, extending the period of agricultural disruption and food insecurity. Administrative records from various kingdoms document the distribution of seed grain as emergency relief, indicating that seed depletion was a recognized consequence of famine conditions. The technology of hunger, inadequate storage and distribution. Ancient Indian civilizations developed sophisticated technologies for food production, but consistently failed to create adequate systems for food storage and distribution. This technological gap between production and preservation meant that even good harvests could not provide security against future shortages, while the benefit of agricultural surplus were unevenly distributed throughout society. Storage systems and their failures. Archaeological excavations of ancient storage facilities reveal both the sophistication and the limitations of ancient Indian food preservation technologies. Granaries were often well-designed structures with features intended to protect stored grain from moisture, rodents, and insects, but they were consistently inadequate for scale of need during extended emergencies. Analysis of ancient granary content shows evidence of widespread spoilage and pest infestation that would have rendered much stored grain inedible or nutritionally inadequate. Archaeobotanical studies reveal that stored grains often showed signs of fungal infection, insect damage, and deterioration that would have made them dangerous to consume. The preservation technologies available to ancient populations, primarily drying and sealing, were insufficient for long-term storage in tropical climates. The capacity of ancient storage systems was also inadequate for providing security during multi-year droughts. Mathematical analysis of excavated granary volumes compared to estimated population sizes indicates that most ancient Indian settlements could store only a few months' worth of food, far short of what would be needed during the multi-year droughts that archaeological and historical records show were common occurrences. Transportation and distribution challenges. Even when surplus food was available in some regions, the transportation technologies of ancient India were inadequate for moving large quantities of grain over the distances necessary to relieve famine-stricken areas. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient transportation systems were designed for moving high-value, low-weight goods like spices and luxury items rather than bulk commodities like grain. The poor condition of ancient roads and the limitations of animal-powered transportation meant that moving significant quantities of food over long distances was prohibitively expensive and slow. Administrative records document attempts to transport grain during famines, but these efforts were typically too little and too late to prevent mass starvation in affected regions. River transportation, while more efficient than overland transport, was limited by seasonal water levels and required infrastructure that was often inadequate for emergency food distribution. Archaeological surveys of ancient river ports show facilities designed for regular commercial traffic rather than emergency relief operations, indicating that ancient civilizations lacked the logistical capabilities necessary for effective famine relief. Preservation technology limitations. The food preservation technologies available to ancient Indian populations were primitive by modern standards and often resulted in significant nutritional losses even when they prevented complete spoilage. Archaeological analysis of preserved food remains shows that ancient preservation methods often reduce the protein content, vitamin levels, and overall nutritional value of stored foods. Drying, the most common preservation method, removed not just water but also water-soluble vitamins and may preserve foods less palatable and digestible. Fermentation, while effective for preservation, often produce foods with altered nutritional profiles that could contribute to malnutrition even when calories were adequate. The use of salt for food preservation was limited by the availability and cost of salt, which was a valuable commodity that was often inaccessible to lower-income populations. Archaeological evidence shows that salt-preserved foods were primarily available to elite households, while common people relied on less effective preservation methods that resulted in greater food loss and nutritional deficiency. The architecture of inequality, how elites hoarded while masses starved. The distribution of food resources in ancient India was characterized by extreme inequality that became even more pronounced during periods of scarcity. While elites maintained elaborate feasting traditions and accumulated vast food stores, the majority of the population lived in constant food insecurity that became life-threatening during even minor agricultural disruptions. Elite food security and conspicuous consumption. Archaeological evidence from elite residential contexts reveals food storage and consumption patterns that contrast starkly with those of common people. Elite households maintained large granaries, elaborate cooking facilities, and evidence of diverse, high-quality diets even during periods when the general population was experiencing food shortages. Excavations of royal palaces and wealthy merchant houses show evidence of feast preparation facilities capable of feeding hundreds of people, indicating that elite food consumption often involved deliberate displays of abundance even during times of general scarcity. These conspicuous consumption practices served to reinforce social hierarchies, while consuming resources that could have alleviated suffering among the general population. Administrative records document the maintenance of royal granaries and elite food stores that were kept filled even during famines that killed thousands of common people. These records reveal a systematic prioritization of elite food security over general welfare that treated mass starvation as acceptable collateral damage for maintaining the comfort and status of privileged classes. Systematic resource extraction. The food security of elites was maintained through systematic extraction of resources from agricultural populations who were often left with barely enough to survive. Tax records and administrative documents reveal that farmers were required to surrender substantial portions of their harvest as taxes, tribute, and religious donations, leaving minimal reserves for their own families. Archaeological analysis of rural settlements shows evidence of chronic malnutrition among farming populations even during normal agricultural years, suggesting that the extraction of agricultural surplus left producers with inadequate nutrition. The systematic undernourishment of agricultural workers reduced their productivity and resilience, creating vulnerabilities that became catastrophic during drought years. The religious justification for resource extraction added another layer of exploitation, as farmers were required to donate food to temples and religious institutions even when their own families were hungry. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows massive storage facilities and evidence of elaborate food offerings that represented significant diversions of resources from hungry populations. Market manipulation and speculation. Ancient Indian grain markets were subject to manipulation by wealthy merchants and officials who could artificially create scarcity to drive up prices and increase profits. Administrative records document cases where grain was hoarded during good years and sold at inflated prices during shortages, maximizing profit while maximizing suffering for those who could not afford inflated food prices. Archaeological evidence from ancient marketplaces shows storage facilities that appear designed for holding large quantities of grain for extended periods, suggesting systematic hoarding practices. These facilities were often located in defensible positions and show evidence of security features that indicate their owners were aware that their hoarding practices created social tensions. The concentration of grain ownership in the hands of a few wealthy individuals or families meant that food distribution was controlled by market forces rather than humanitarian considerations. During famines, those with money could still obtain food, while those without resources starved, creating artificial scarcity for the poor even when adequate food supplies existed in the region. Famine. When civilization collapsed into cannibalism, the most devastating consequence of chronic food insecurity in ancient India was the periodic famines that pushed entire populations beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior. During these extreme events, social structures collapsed, moral norms disappeared, and people were reduced to the most desperate survival strategies, including cannibalism. The archaeology of desperation. Archaeological evidence of extreme famine conditions comes from multiple sources, including skeletal remains that show evidence of extreme malnutrition, cut marks consistent with cannibalism, and sudden abandonment of settlements during periods that correspond to known drought cycles. These archaeological indicators provide physical evidence of suffering that historical texts often describe in euphemistic terms. Analysis of human skeletal remains from famine periods shows evidence of severe malnutrition that progressed to the point where people's bodies began consuming their own muscle and organ tissue. These remains display characteristic bone changes that indicate prolonged starvation, including decreased bone density, stunted growth, and pathological changes that reflect the body's desperate attempts to survive on inadequate nutrition. Some skeletal assemblages from famine periods show cut marks and breakage patterns that are consistent with cannibalism, indicating that some populations were driven to consume human flesh when all other food sources were exhausted. While such evidence is relatively rare, its presence in an archaeological record confirms that cannibalism did occur during the most extreme famine conditions. Social collapse and moral breakdown. Historical accounts of severe famines describe the complete breakdown of social norms and family relationships as people were driven to desperate measures for survival. These accounts describe parents abandoning children, families breaking apart, and communities dissolving as individuals focused solely on personal survival. Archaeological evidence supports these historical descriptions through analysis of settlement patterns and household arrangements during famine periods. Many sites show evidence of sudden abandonment, with household goods left scattered as if people fled rapidly. Some sites show evidence of violence within households, possibly reflecting conflicts over scarce food resources. The breakdown of normal social relationships during famines had lasting effects on communities that survived these catastrophic events. Archaeological evidence suggests that some settlements never recovered their pre-famine population levels or social organization, indicating that severe famines could permanently alter the social fabric of affected regions. Documentation of the unthinkable. While ancient texts rarely describe cannibalism explicitly, they contain coded references and euphemisms that indicate its occurrence during severe famines. Legal texts include provisions for dealing with cannibalism, suggesting that it was recognized as a potential consequence of extreme food shortages rather than an unimaginable aberration. Administrative records from various kingdoms document emergency measures taken during famines, including the distribution of seed grain, the organization of relief camps, and the movement of populations away from affected areas. These records reveal that governments recognized the potential for social collapse during severe food shortages and attempted to prevent the most extreme consequences. Religious texts contain references to famines so severe that normal moral and social rules were suspended, including restrictions on food types and social interactions. These references suggest that extreme hunger could override even the most fundamental religious and social taboos, indicating the desperate conditions that ancient populations sometimes faced. The psychological and social impact of chronic hunger. Living with constant food insecurity had profound effects on ancient Indian society that extended far beyond immediate nutritional deficiency. Chronic hunger affected cognitive development, social relationships, cultural practices, and political structures in ways that shaped the fundamental character of ancient Indian civilization. Cognitive and behavioral effects. Modern research on nutrition and cognitive development helps explain many aspects of ancient Indian society that might otherwise seem puzzling. Chronic malnutrition during childhood development reduces cognitive capacity, educational achievement, and problem-solving abilities, creating populations that were intellectually constrained by their nutritional circumstances. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from ancient India shows widespread evidence of childhood malnutrition that would have affected brain development and cognitive capacity. These findings suggest that much of the ancient Indian population was operating with reduced intellectual capacity due to nutritional deficiency, limiting their ability to develop solutions to their problems or challenge existing social arrangements. The psychological effects of chronic hunger include increased aggression, reduced empathy, and shortened time horizons that prioritize immediate survival over long-term planning. These psychological adaptations to food insecurity help explain many aspects of ancient Indian social behavior, including the acceptance of extreme inequality and the focus on immediate religious rituals rather than long-term social reform. Social solidarity and competition. Chronic food insecurity created complex dynamics of cooperation and competition within ancient Indian communities. Archaeological evidence shows that communities developed elaborate sharing systems and mutual support networks to help members survive periodic shortages. But these same communities could quickly dissolve into violent competition when resources became extremely scarce. The caste system can be understood partly as a response to chronic food insecurity, creating rigid social hierarchies that regulated access to resources and reduced competition during times of scarcity. By assigning specific economic roles and resource allocation rights to different social groups, the caste system may have reduced conflict over scarce resources while ensuring that some groups maintain adequate nutrition to preserve essential skills and knowledge. Religious and cultural practices in ancient India often focused on food-related concerns, including elaborate rituals for ensuring agricultural success, religious restrictions on food consumption, and social customs that regulated food sharing and distribution. These practices reflect a civilization that was constantly preoccupied with food security and survival. Political implications of hunger. Chronic food insecurity had significant political implications for ancient Indian kingdoms, as rulers needed to maintain legitimacy while managing populations that were constantly on the edge of starvation. The provision of food during emergencies became a crucial measure of governmental effectiveness, while failure to prevent famine could lead to political upheaval and social collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that many ancient Indian political structures were designed primarily to extract and redistribute food resources rather than promote general welfare or development. The massive storage facilities, administrative systems, and military forces maintained by ancient kingdoms were often focused on controlling food distribution and suppressing unrest related to hunger. The religious legitimation of ancient Indian rulers often emphasized their responsibility for ensuring adequate rainfall and agricultural success. This connection between political legitimacy and food security created additional pressure on rulers to maintain agricultural productivity, while providing them with religious justification for extracting resources from their subjects to support the state apparatus. The environmental consequences of desperation. Chronic food insecurity drove ancient Indian populations to engage in environmentally destructive practices that provided short-term survival benefits while creating long-term ecological problems. These practices contributed to environmental degradation that made future food insecurity more likely, creating vicious cycles of environmental destruction and human suffering. Deforestation and soil degradation. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Indian populations regularly cleared forests for agricultural expansion during periods of food shortage, even when these lands were unsuitable for sustainable agriculture. This deforestation contributed to soil erosion, reduced water retention, and climate changes that made agriculture more difficult in the long term. The pressure to maximize short-term food production led to agricultural practices that depleted soil fertility and reduced long-term productivity. Archaeological analysis of ancient agricultural sites shows evidence of intensive cultivation practices that would have quickly exhausted soil nutrients, forcing farmers to abandon depleted lands and clear new areas for cultivation. The use of marginal lands for agriculture during food shortages contributed to environmental degradation that affected entire watersheds and regional ecosystems. Archaeological surveys show evidence of abandoned agricultural terraces, eroded hillsides, and degraded landscapes that reflect desperate attempts to extract food from unsuitable environments. Wildlife depletion and ecosystem collapse. Extreme hunger drove ancient populations to hunt and consume wildlife species to the point of local extinction, reducing biodiversity and disrupting ecological relationships that had previously supported sustainable resource use. Archaeological evidence shows significant changes in wildlife populations that correspond to periods of human food shortage and population pressure. The consumption of seed-dispersing animals during famines disrupted forest regeneration and reduced the productivity of natural ecosystems that had previously provided supplementary food resources. This ecological disruption made communities more dependent on agriculture while reducing the natural resources that could provide backup nutrition during agricultural failures. The pressure to obtain protein during food shortages led to fishing and hunting practices that depleted aquatic and terrestrial animal populations beyond their ability to recover. Archaeological evidence shows dramatic declines in fish and game remains at sites associated with periods of food scarcity, indicating intensive exploitation of these resources during desperate times. The legacy of perpetual hunger. The chronic food insecurity that characterized ancient Indian civilization had lasting effects that shaped social structures, cultural practices, and human behavior patterns that persisted long after the immediate causes of hunger were addressed. Understanding this legacy of perpetual hunger helps explain many aspects of ancient Indian society that might otherwise seem incomprehensible or irrational. Cultural adaptations to scarcity. Ancient Indian cultural practices often reflected adaptations to chronic food insecurity, including religious festivals that coincided with harvest times, social customs that regulated food sharing and consumption, and philosophical traditions that emphasize acceptance of suffering and minimal material needs. The emphasis on spiritual over material concerns in ancient Indian philosophy can be understood partly as a psychological adaptation to chronic scarcity, providing meaning and purpose for populations whose material needs were rarely adequately met. This spiritual focus helped people cope with harsh material conditions while discouraging challenges to social systems that perpetuated scarcity and inequality. Archaeological evidence of food-related cultural practices includes elaborate temple complexes designed for food offerings, household shrines associated with agricultural deities, and burial practices that reflected beliefs about food and sustenance in afterlife contexts. These cultural adaptations reveal a civilization that was constantly concerned with food security and survival. Part 8. Brutal and unequal judiciary. The judicial system of medieval Europe stood as one of history's most glaring examples of institutionalized brutality and inequality. Far from the modern ideals of impartial justice and equal treatment under the law, medieval courts operated on principles that would horrify contemporary observers. Justice was not blind. It saw class, wealth, and social status with devastating clarity, meting out punishments that reflected not the crime committed, but the social position of both victim and perpetrator. The theater of pain, corporal punishment as standard practice. Medieval justice was fundamentally rooted in the belief that physical suffering was not only an appropriate response to wrongdoing, but often the primary means of determining truth and delivering punishment. Corporal punishment formed the backbone of the judicial system, with mutilation and public flogging serving as standard sentences for a vast array of offenses. Mutilation was perhaps the most visible and permanent form of medieval justice. Thieves routinely lost fingers or hands, with repeat offenders facing increasingly severe amputations. The loss of a hand didn't merely serve as punishment, it marked the criminal permanently, ensuring they could never fully reintegrate into society. Forgers might have their writing hand severed, while perjurers could face the removal of their tongue. These punishments served multiple purposes: retribution, deterrence, and permanent identification of the criminal. The brutality extended beyond simple amputation. Branding with hot irons was commonplace, searing letters or symbols into the flesh to mark criminals for life. An A for adultery, T for thief, or M for murder would forever identify the bearer's transgression. This practice ensured that punishment extended far beyond the moment of sentencing, following the individual for the remainder of their life and affecting their ability to find work, marry, or participate fully in community life. Public flogging represented another cornerstone of medieval punishment. These spectacles drew crowds who gathered to witness justice being delivered through the crack of the whip. The number of lashes varied according to the crime and the social status of the offender, with some sentences calling for hundreds of strokes that could easily prove fatal. The public nature of these punishments was deliberate. They served as both entertainment and warning, reinforcing social hierarchies while demonstrating the consequences of transgression. The pillory and stocks provided additional forms of public humiliation and physical torment. Offenders would be secured in these devices for hours or days, exposed to the elements and the cruelty of passing crowds who were encouraged to pelt them with rotten food, stones, or worse. These punishments often resulted in permanent injury or death, particularly when crowds became particularly vengeful. Divine justice, the role of ordeals in determining guilt. Perhaps no aspect of medieval justice seems more foreign to modern sensibilities than the reliance on ordeals, trials by divine intervention, designed to determine guilt or innocence through supernatural means. These practices reflected the medieval belief that God would directly intervene in human affairs to ensure justice was served, revealing truth through miraculous signs. The ordeal by fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance or walk barefoot over burning coals. After the ordeal, the wounds would be bandaged and examined 3 days later. If they were healing cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If infected or festering, they were guilty. This practice placed impossible burdens on the accused, as proper wound care was virtually unknown, and infection was almost inevitable given medieval hygiene standards. Water ordeals took 2 primary forms, both equally deadly. In the ordeal by hot water, the accused had to retrieve an object from a cauldron of boiling water, with guilt or innocence determined by how their burns healed. The ordeal by cold water involved binding the accused and throwing them into a body of water. If they sank, they were innocent, though likely drowned, while floating indicated guilt, as the pure water supposedly rejected the corrupt soul. The ordeal of the cross represented a less immediately lethal, but equally arbitrary form of divine trial. 2 parties would stand with their arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, with the first to lower their arms declared the loser. This practice often determined matters of significant legal consequence, including property disputes and accusations of serious crimes, based entirely on physical endurance rather than evidence or truth. Combat trials extended this principle to armed conflict, particularly among the nobility. Disputants or their champions would fight, with victory interpreted as divine judgment in favor of the winner. These trials could result in death or serious injury, and their outcomes determined legal decisions regardless of the actual merits of the case. The wealthy could hire professional champions, while the poor faced their opponents personally, creating yet another layer of inequality in the justice system. The poisonous hierarchy, caste-specific justice. Medieval justice operated on the fundamental principle that different classes of people deserved different standards of treatment under the law. This wasn't merely a matter of varying fines or punishments. It represented a complete rejection of the concept that all individuals possessed equal worth before the law. Nobles enjoyed extensive legal privileges that effectively placed them above common law. When accused of crimes, they could often demand trial by combat rather than submitting to the ordeals imposed on commoners. Their penalties, even for serious offenses, typically involved fines, temporary loss of lands, or brief imprisonment rather than the physical punishments routinely inflicted on lower classes. A noble who killed a peasant might face a monetary penalty, while a peasant who raised a hand against a noble faced death or mutilation. The church maintained its own parallel legal system, claiming jurisdiction over clergy and matters deemed spiritual in nature. Ecclesiastical courts could offer sanctuary to criminals who could claim clerical status, a privilege that extended not only to ordained priests, but to anyone who could demonstrate literacy, a skill so rare that it served as proof of clerical education. This benefit of clergy allowed the educated classes to escape secular punishment for even serious crimes, creating a 2-tiered system where learning provided legal immunity. Merchants and artisans occupied a middle ground, often subject to specialized commercial courts that focus on restitution rather than punishment. Their penalties typically involve financial compensation and loss of trading privileges rather than physical harm. However, this relative leniency depended entirely on their ability to pay fines and their value to the local economy. Peasants and serfs faced the harshest treatment under medieval law. Their punishments for identical crimes were invariably more severe than those imposed on higher classes, and they had virtually no legal recourse against abuse by their superiors. A serf accused of theft might lose a hand, while a noble guilty of the same offense would pay a fine. This disparity wasn't considered unjust. It was a natural order, reflecting medieval beliefs about the inherent worth of different social classes. Women faced additional legal disabilities, regardless of their social class. They could rarely testify in court, particularly against men, and their legal standing depended entirely on their relationships to male relatives or husbands. Accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or other morally charged offenses subjected women to particularly brutal punishments, often involving public humiliation and physical torture designed to reinforce their subordinate status. The corruption of courts, justice for sale. Medieval courts operated in an environment where corruption was an aberration. It was standard practice. Judges, court officials, and local lords who administered justice viewed their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. The systematic corruption ensured that justice flowed toward those with means to purchase it, while the poor faced predetermined guilt. Judges openly accepted bribes, viewing them as legitimate supplements to their income rather than corrupt payments. The concept of judicial impartiality simply didn't exist in a system where legal officials were expected to profit from their positions. Court records frequently show identical crimes receiving vastly different punishments based on the payments made by the accused or their families. Local lords who held judicial authority over their territories treated court proceedings as revenue streams. Fines and confiscated property filled their treasuries, creating powerful incentives to ensure guilty verdicts regardless of evidence. The more severe the punishment, the greater the financial benefit to court, establishing a system where mercy was literally unprofitable. Court officials, from clerks to bailiffs, demanded payments for every service, no matter how basic. Filing charges, presenting evidence, or even appearing before the court required fees that placed justice beyond the reach of the poorest members of society. Those who couldn't pay found themselves unable to access the legal system at all, effectively placing them outside the protection of the law. The sale of judicial positions created additional layers of corruption. Wealthy individuals could purchase the right to serve as judges or court officials, viewing these roles as investments that would generate profits through fees and bribes. This practice ensured that those who administered justice had no training, expertise, or commitment to fair legal proceedings, only a desire to recoup their investment and generate profits. The absence of justice, missing modern legal concepts. The medieval legal system lacked virtually every concept that modern societies consider fundamental to fair judicial proceedings. The presumption of innocence, the principle that accused individuals are considered innocent until proven guilty, was entirely foreign to medieval courts. Accusations were treated as evidence, and the burden fell on the accused to prove their innocence rather than on prosecutors to establish guilt. The right to legal representation didn't exist for the vast majority of the population. While nobles might bring advisors to court proceedings, common people faced accusations alone, without knowledge of legal procedures or assistance in presenting their defense. This isolation made them vulnerable to manipulation and ensured that complex legal matters were decided without proper advocacy for the accused. Due process, the concept that legal proceedings must follow established rules and procedures, was largely absent from medieval courts. Judges could alter procedures at will, accept or reject evidence based on personal whims, and impose sentences without regard for precedent or consistency. This arbitrariness meant that identical cases could result in completely different outcomes depending on the mood, interests, or financial incentives of the presiding officials. The concept of rehabilitation, the idea that punishment should aim to reform criminals and prepare them for reintegration into society, was entirely absent from medieval thinking. Punishment existed solely for retribution, deterrence, and profit, with no consideration given to helping offenders become productive members of society. The permanent mutilations and social marking that characterized medieval punishment actively prevented any form of meaningful rehabilitation. Medieval justice represented the systematic institutionalization of inequality, brutality, and corruption. It served not to protect society or ensure fair treatment of individuals, but to reinforce existing power structures while generating revenue for those in positions of authority. This system created a world where justice was literally for sale, where social position determined legal outcomes, and where the concept of fairness and impartiality that modern societies take for granted were not merely absent, but actively rejected as contrary to the natural order. The legacy of these brutal practices serves as a stark reminder of how far human societies have progressed in their understanding of justice, equality, and human dignity. Part 9. Child Labor and Systematic Exploitation. Medieval Europe's treatment of children reveals one of history's most disturbing examples of systematic exploitation and institutionalized abuse. In a world where childhood as a protected phase of life simply did not exist for the vast majority of the population, children were viewed primarily as economic assets to be exploited from the earliest possible age. The concept of child welfare, protection from hazardous labor, or the right to education was not merely absent. It was actively contradicted by social structures that demanded the immediate productive contribution of every member of society, regardless of age or physical development. The theft of childhood, labor from the earliest years. Medieval society operated on the brutal premise that children became economically useful the moment they could perform basic tasks, typically around the ages of 5 or 6. This wasn't a gradual introduction to responsibility or age-appropriate contribution to family welfare. It represented the complete elimination of any protected period of childhood development. Children were thrust into adult responsibilities and dangerous working conditions with no consideration for their physical limitations, psychological needs, or developmental requirements. Agricultural communities, which comprised the vast majority of medieval settlements, relied heavily on child labor to maintain their subsistence-level existence. Children as young as 5 were expected to tend livestock, scatter seeds, collect eggs, and perform countless other farm tasks that modern societies would consider entirely inappropriate for such young ages. By age 7 or 8, children were working full days alongside adults. Their small stature utilized for tasks like crawling under low-hanging grain or fitting into tight spaces that adults couldn't access. The physical demands placed on these young workers were staggering. Children carried heavy loads that strained their developing muscles and bones, worked in all-weather conditions without adequate clothing or protection, and performed repetitive motions that led to permanent physical deformities. Curved spines, stunted growth, and chronic joint problems were common among children who began heavy labor before their bodies had properly developed. These physical consequences followed them throughout their lives, marking them permanently as members of the laboring class. Seasonal agricultural work created particularly brutal conditions for child laborers. Harvest time demanded long hours of backbreaking work, with children expected to match adult productivity despite their physical limitations. During grain harvest, children worked from dawn to dusk cutting wheat and barley with sharp sickles, their hands bleeding from the repetitive motions and their backs aching from constant bending. Hop picking required children to climb tall poles and navigate through thorny vines, resulting in frequent injuries and falls. Urban environments offered no respite from child exploitation. Street children, orphaned or abandoned, survived through begging, petty theft, and whatever menial labor they could find. These children faced constant threats of violence, starvation, and abuse, with no social safety net to protect them. Many were pressed into service as messengers, street sweepers, or waste collectors, working in conditions that exposed them to disease and injury while providing barely enough income to survive. Death in the darkness, children in hazardous industries. The most horrific examples of medieval child exploitation occurred in the emerging industrial sectors, where young bodies were viewed as perfectly suited for dangerous work that adults found difficult or impossible to perform. Mining operations across Europe relied heavily on child labor, sending children as young as 6 years old into underground passages where they faced constant threats of cave-ins, explosions, flooding, and toxic gas exposure. Children in mines performed some of the most dangerous tasks imaginable. They crawled through narrow passages to reach coal or deposits that adult miners couldn't access, their small size making them valuable for expanding existing tunnels and reaching new deposits. These children worked in complete darkness, guided only by flickering candles that provided minimal light while creating additional fire hazards. Cave-ins were common, and children trapped in collapsed tunnels rarely survived rescue attempts. The physical toll of mining on young bodies was catastrophic. Children developed severe respiratory problems from inhaling coal dust and toxic particles, leading to early death from what would later be recognized as black lung disease and other occupational illnesses. Their growth was stunted by poor nutrition, constant physical stress, and exposure to harmful substances. Many children suffered permanent injuries from mining accidents, losing limbs to cave-ins or explosions while continuing to work in whatever capacity their remaining physical abilities allowed. Metallurgical operations presented equally deadly hazards for child workers. Children tended furnaces that reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, their job being to maintain fires and move materials despite the constant threat of severe burns. They operated bellows for hours at a time, developing respiratory problems from inhaling smoke and toxic fumes, while risking severe injury from the sparks and molten metal that frequently flew from forges and furnaces. The emerging textile industry exploited children in ways that would become infamous centuries later during the Industrial Revolution, but medieval textile production already demonstrated the systematic abuse of young workers. Children operated spinning wheels and looms for 12 to 16 hours daily, their small fingers perfect for threading needles and handling delicate materials. However, the repetitive motions required for textile work caused severe arthritis and joint deformities in children whose bones and muscles were still developing. Glassmaking represented another industry that relied heavily on child labor while exposing young workers to extreme dangers. Children worked near furnaces that reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees, handling molten glass and operating tools that frequently caused severe burns. The constant exposure to extreme heat and toxic fumes from glass production led to respiratory problems, heat exhaustion, and frequent accidents that left children permanently disabled. Bondage disguised as training. The apprenticeship system. The medieval apprenticeship system, often romanticized in modern accounts as a form of vocational education, actually represented a sophisticated form of legalized child slavery that condemned young people to years of unpaid labor under conditions of systematic abuse and exploitation. Apprentices, typically bound to masters between the ages of 7 and 14, became the legal property of their masters, with no rights, protections, or recourse against mistreatment. The apprenticeship contract, signed by parents desperate to reduce the number of mouths to feed, typically bound children for 7 to 14 years of unpaid service. During this period, the child belonged entirely to the master craftsman, who could use them for any type of work, punish them physically, restrict their movements, and even sell their contract to other masters. The promise of learning a trade was often illusory, with many apprentices spending their entire terms performing menial labor rather than acquiring valuable skills. Living conditions for apprentices were deliberately harsh, designed to maximize the master's profit while providing minimal care for the children under their control. Apprentices typically slept in workshops or cellars, sharing cramped quarters with multiple other children while receiving inadequate food, clothing, and medical care. Masters viewed any investment in apprentice welfare as cutting into their profits, leading to systematic neglect that resulted in high rates of illness, injury, and death among apprentice children. Physical abuse of apprentices was not only common but legally sanctioned, with masters having a right to discipline their apprentices through beatings, confinement, and other forms of punishment. Many masters used this authority to terrorize apprentices into absolute obedience, creating environments where children lived in constant fear of violence. Sexual abuse of apprentices was also widespread, with young people having no legal recourse against masters who exploited their complete authority over their charges. The economic exploitation of apprentices was systematic and brutal. These children provided years of free labor while generating significant profits for their masters, who could take on multiple apprentices to expand their productive capacity without paying wages. Masters often assigned the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks to apprentices, viewing them as expendable workers whose injuries or deaths represented minor financial losses rather than human tragedies. Many apprentices never completed their terms, dying from overwork, abuse, or occupational hazards before they could achieve journeyman status. Those who survived often found that their promised training was inadequate, leaving them without the skills necessary to establish independent practices. This system perpetuated a cycle of exploitation where former apprentices, desperate for income, took on their own apprentices to exploit in the same manner they had been abused. The privilege of literacy, education as class warfare. Medieval society's approach to education represented one of the most effective systems of class control ever devised, using the deliberate denial of literacy and learning to ensure that social mobility remained virtually impossible for the vast majority of the population. Education was not viewed as a right or even potential benefit for society as a whole, but as a dangerous privilege that could disrupt the established social order if extended beyond the narrow circles of nobility and clergy. The exclusion of girls from formal education was absolute and systematic across all social classes. Even among the nobility, girls received only the most basic instruction in domestic skills and religious observance, with literacy considered unnecessary and potentially dangerous for females. The widespread belief that women's minds were incapable of serious intellectual work provided convenient justification for denying half the population any opportunity for educational advancement. For boys of the peasant and artisan classes, education remained equally inaccessible, but for different reasons. These families couldn't afford the costs associated with schooling, including fees, books, and the lost labor of children who might otherwise contribute to family income. More importantly, the social structure actively discouraged education for lower classes, as literacy and learning were viewed as threats to the established order that kept peasants in their designated roles. The few schools that existed served primarily to train clergy and educate the children of nobility, creating a system where knowledge became a hereditary privilege passed down through elite families. Monastic schools, which provided the majority of formal education, focused heavily on religious instruction and Latin literacy, preparing students for careers in the church hierarchy rather than providing practical education that might benefit broader society. The curriculum in elite schools reflected and reinforced class distinctions, emphasizing classical languages, theological studies, and courtly skills that had no relevance to the lives of common people. This approach ensured that educated individuals could communicate and coordinate among themselves while remaining incomprehensible to the illiterate masses, creating an additional barrier between rulers and the ruled. The ultimate exploitation, the sale of children. Perhaps no practice better illustrates the complete absence of children's rights in medieval society than the routine sale of children during periods of economic hardship. This wasn't a desperate last resort employed only during the most extreme crises. It was a regular feature of medieval life that occurred whenever families faced financial pressure or sought to reduce their household expenses. Parents sold children as young as 5 or 6 to anyone willing to pay, with buyers treating these children as permanent property rather than temporary workers. Unlike apprenticeship contracts, which theoretically provided training in exchange for labor, the outright sale of children involved no pretense of educational benefit or eventual freedom. These children became slaves in all but name, with their new owners having complete authority over their lives, labor, and bodies. The market for children was particularly active during harvest failures, wars, and other crises that disrupted normal economic activity. Desperate families would sell their youngest children first, viewing them as the least economically productive members of the household. Buyers included wealthy merchants seeking domestic servants, craftsmen needing additional workers, and landowners requiring agricultural labor. The prices paid for children reflected their expected economic value, rather than any consideration of their welfare or future prospects. Children sold into domestic service faced lives of constant labor with no hope of freedom or advancement. They worked as servants, cooks, cleaners, and in whatever other capacity their owners demanded, receiving only basic food and shelter in exchange for their complete subjugation. Many were subjected to physical and sexual abuse, with no legal protections or recourse against mistreatment. Agricultural buyers often worked purchased children to death, viewing them as cheaper alternatives to adult workers who might demand wages or better treatment. These children performed the most dangerous and exhausting farm work, from dawn to dusk, in all weather conditions, with minimal food and shelter. Their short life expectancy was factored into the purchase price, with buyers expecting to replace dead children with new purchases as needed. The psychological trauma inflicted on children through sale and separation from their families was never considered by medieval society. Children torn from their homes and sold to strangers experienced profound emotional damage that affected them throughout their shortened lives. The complete absence of any support system or recognition of their humanity left these children vulnerable to every form of exploitation and abuse imaginable. Medieval childhood represented one of history's greatest failures of human compassion and social organization. The systematic exploitation of children through dangerous labor, abuse of apprenticeships, educational exclusion, and outright slavery created a society that consumed its youngest members to maintain the privileges of adults. This system not only caused immeasurable suffering for individual children, but also stunted the intellectual and cultural development of entire civilizations by denying education and opportunity to the vast majority of the population. The legacy of medieval child exploitation serves as a stark reminder of what occurs when societies fail to recognize the fundamental rights and dignity of their most vulnerable members. Part 10. Conclusion: Lessons for the Present. As we close this unflinching examination of medieval European life, we are confronted with a stark reality that challenges many of our preconceptions about the past. The romanticized vision of knights, nobles, and pastoral simplicity dissolves under the weight of historical evidence that reveals a world of extraordinary brutality, systematic oppression, and human suffering on a scale that modern minds struggle to comprehend. This journey through the harsh realities of medieval existence serves not merely as an academic exercise, but as a profound reminder how far human civilization has progressed and how fragile these advances truly are, the accumulated weight of medieval suffering. The comprehensive picture that emerges from examining medieval European society reveals a civilization trapped in cycles of violence, exploitation, and misery that touched every aspect of human existence. The feudal system created a rigid hierarchy where the vast majority of people lived as virtual slaves, bound to land they could never own and subjected to the arbitrary whims of masters who viewed them as property rather than human beings. The 90% of the population who worked the fields lived in conditions of perpetual hunger, disease, and fear, their entire existence dedicated to producing wealth they would never share. Women in the society face a double burden of class oppression and gender-based subjugation that reduce them to property to be traded, breeding stock to produce heirs, or convenient scapegoats for society's ills. The systematic denial of their basic rights, combined with the constant threat of violence and the deadly reality of childbirth without medical care, made female existence particularly precarious and painful. Children, rather than being protected and nurtured, were immediately pressed into dangerous labor that stunted their growth, destroyed their health, and often ended their lives before they reached adulthood. The concept of childhood as a protected phase of development simply did not exist for the overwhelming majority of young people, who were viewed as small adults expected to contribute economically from the moment they could walk. The medieval approach to justice represented perhaps the most systematic abandonment of human dignity, where courts operated as profit centers dispensing arbitrary punishments based on social class rather than evidence or fairness. The routine use of torture, mutilation, and execution as standard responses to minor infractions created a climate of terror that reinforced existing power structures while destroying any hope of social mobility or reform. Religious institutions, rather than providing comfort and moral guidance, operated as instruments of control and exploitation, extracting wealth from the desperate, while threatening eternal damnation for those who questioned the established order. The Church's role in perpetuating ignorance, suppressing dissent, and justifying inequality made it complicit in maintaining the very conditions that caused such widespread suffering. Disease and death stalked every medieval community with relentless efficiency, aided by complete ignorance of basic hygiene, nutrition, and medical care. The average person could expect to live barely 3 decades, most of them filled with pain, hunger, and fear. Epidemic diseases periodically swept away substantial portions of the population, while everyday ailments that modern medicine treats routinely proved fatal to medieval sufferers. The miraculous transformation, progress against all odds. Standing in stark contrast to this medieval nightmare is the unprecedented improvement in human conditions that subsequent centuries have achieved. The transformation from medieval brutality to modern civilization represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, accomplished through the gradual accumulation of knowledge, technological innovation, and evolving concepts of human rights and dignity. Modern life expectancy in developed nations has more than doubled since medieval times, with most people now able to expect not just longer lives but healthier, more comfortable ones. Diseases that terrorized medieval populations have been eliminated entirely, while others have been reduced to minor inconveniences through vaccination, sanitation, and medical treatment. The routine availability of clean water, adequate nutrition, and basic health care represents luxuries that medieval kings could not have imagined. The expansion of education from an elite privilege to a near-universal right has transformed human potential in ways that would have seemed miraculous to medieval observers. Literacy rates have grown from perhaps 5% in medieval Europe to near-universal levels in developed nations, creating populations capable of critical thinking, innovation, and participation in democratic governance. The ability of ordinary people to access information, express opinions, and challenge authority represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Legal systems based on principles of equality, due process, and human rights have replaced the arbitrary brutality of medieval justice. While imperfect, modern courts operate on assumptions that would have been revolutionary in medieval times. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, proportional punishment, and the possibility of rehabilitation. These advances represent not just improvements in legal procedure, but fundamental shifts in how societies view human dignity and worth. Women's rights, though still evolving, have progressed from complete subjugation to legal equality in many societies. The ability of women to own property, pursue education, choose their own partners, and participate in political life represents gains that required centuries of struggle against entrenched systems of oppression. Similarly, children's rights have evolved from non-existence to comprehensive protections that recognize childhood as a distinct phase requiring special care and protection. Economic systems, despite their imperfections, have created opportunities for social mobility that were literally inconceivable in medieval times. The possibility that individuals can improve their circumstances through education, innovation, or entrepreneurship represents a dramatic departure from the rigid class structures that trapped medieval people in the circumstances of their birth. The imperative of historical honesty. The temptation to romanticize the past represents one of the most dangerous forms of historical ignorance, as it obscures the real conditions that shaped human experience and minimizes the significance of genuine progress. Medieval Europe was not a time of noble knights, pastoral simplicity, or spiritual purity. It was an era of systematic brutality, crushing poverty, and institutionalized oppression that modern people would find literally unbearable. This romanticization serves several harmful purposes. It minimizes the achievement of those who work to improve human conditions by suggesting that the past was somehow preferable to the present. It obscures the real causes of historical suffering by focusing on surface appearances rather than underlying systems of exploitation. Most dangerously, it can make people nostalgic for social arrangements that were fundamentally unjust and inhumane. Honest historical study requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about how our ancestors lived and died. Medieval people were not somehow more virtuous or spiritually pure than modern individuals. They were human beings trapped in systems that offered few opportunities for moral choice or personal development. Their apparent acceptance of conditions we would consider intolerable reflected not contentment, but the absence of alternatives and the brutal suppression of dissent. The study of medieval life also reveals how social systems can normalize even the most extreme forms of suffering and injustice. Medieval people did not generally question serfdom, child labor, or judicial torture, because these practices were embedded in religious and philosophical frameworks that presented them as natural and inevitable. This historical perspective should make us more skeptical of our own assumptions and more vigilant about identifying and challenging injustices in contemporary society. Persistent shadows, medieval echoes in modern times. While celebrating the genuine progress that separates modern life from medieval brutality, we must also acknowledge that many of the fundamental problems that plague medieval society persist in different forms today. The human capacity for creating and maintaining systems of oppression did not disappear with the end of the Middle Ages, and contemporary societies continue to struggle with issues that have deep historical roots. Economic inequality, while less extreme than the medieval divide between lords and serfs, remains a defining feature of modern societies. The concentration of wealth in the hands of small elites, while large populations struggle with poverty, echoes medieval patterns of resource distribution. The ability of wealth to purchase superior justice, education, and healthcare creates class distinctions that, while less rigid than medieval hierarchies, still limit opportunities for genuine equality. Gender-based discrimination and violence continue to affect women worldwide, though in forms that will be familiar to medieval observers. The persistence of honor killings, forced marriages, educational exclusion, and economic discrimination in many parts of the world demonstrates that the medieval treatment of women was not an historical aberration, but part of ongoing patterns of oppression that require constant vigilance to combat. Child labor remains a global problem, affecting millions of young people who work in conditions that differ little from those faced by medieval children. While legal protections exist in many countries, enforcement remains inadequate and economic pressures continue to drive families to sacrifice their children's welfare for immediate survival needs. Corruption in legal and political systems continues to undermine justice in ways that echo medieval practices. The ability of wealth and power to escape accountability, the use of legal systems to persecute political opponents, and the arbitrary application of laws based on social status remain features of many contemporary societies. Religious and ideological extremism continues to justify violence, oppression, and the suppression of dissent in ways that mirror medieval practices. The use of religious authority to control behavior, limit intellectual freedom, and persecute minorities represents a continuation of patterns established during the medieval period. The privilege of perspective. Appreciating contemporary life. Understanding the harsh realities of medieval life should inspire profound gratitude for the privileges of contemporary existence, even as we work to address remaining problems and inequalities. The ability to read these words, to access information freely, to express opinions without fear of torture or execution, and to envision a better future represents achievements that required centuries of struggle against systems designed to prevent exactly these freedoms. The simple act of drinking clean water from a tap represents a miracle that medieval people could not have imagined. The availability of antibiotics, painkillers, and basic medical care means that conditions that routinely killed our ancestors have become minor inconveniences. The ability to communicate instantly across vast distances, to travel safely, and to access entertainment and education represents luxuries beyond the wildest dreams of medieval kings. The legal protections that modern citizens take for granted, the right to a fair trial, protection from arbitrary arrest, the ability to own property and pursue economic opportunities, represent hard-won victories against systems of oppression that dominated human societies for millennia. The very concept that governments exist to serve their citizens rather than exploit them represents a revolutionary idea that medieval people could barely comprehend. Even the problems that define contemporary political discourse, debates about the extent of social programs, the proper balance between security and privacy, or the appropriate level of government regulation, represent luxuries available only to societies that have solved the basic problems of survival that consume medieval life. The ability to argue about these issues in public forums without fear of execution demonstrates progress that should not be taken for granted. The continuous struggle for human dignity. The journey from medieval brutality to modern civilization was neither inevitable nor complete. Every advance in human rights, every improvement in living conditions, and every expansion of opportunity required individuals and groups to challenge existing systems, often at great personal cost. The freedoms and protections that contemporary societies enjoy exist because previous generations were willing to fight against seemingly insurmountable odds to create better conditions for their descendants. This historical perspective should inspire both humility and determination in addressing contemporary challenges. The magnitude of progress achieved over centuries demonstrates that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be changed through sustained effort and moral courage. At the same time, the persistence of many medieval problems in new forms reminds us that progress is never guaranteed and requires constant vigilance to maintain. The study of medieval life should also remind us that social arrangements we consider normal and natural are actually historical constructions that can be changed. Medieval people believed that serfdom, child labor, and judicial torture were ordained by God and essential to social order. Their inability to imagine alternatives limited their capacity to create change. Contemporary societies face similar limitations in addressing problems like poverty, inequality, and environmental destruction, but historical perspective suggests that these challenges are not insurmountable if we can develop the imagination and will to address them. The privilege of living in an era when we can study the past honestly, criticize existing arrangements, and work toward better futures carries with it the responsibility to use these advantages wisely. The medieval people who suffered under systems they could not change would likely consider our opportunities to create positive change as precious gifts that should not be wasted on complacency or despair. Understanding where we have come from provides essential context for determining where we should go. The journey from medieval darkness to modern enlightenment, however incomplete, demonstrates humanity's capacity for moral and practical progress. This knowledge should inspire confidence that current challenges can be addressed while maintaining appropriate humility about the difficulty of creating lasting positive change. The study of history, conducted with honesty and intellectual courage, remains one of our most valuable tools for building a more just and humane future.